The morning Alara Voss's name appeared in the London Gazette, alongside the title of the Duke of Ashmore, the city did not pause to celebrate. It paused to gossip. By noon, the news had traveled from the printing houses on Fleet Street to the drawing rooms of Mayfair, carried on the lips of women, who spoke in low voices, but chose their words like weapons. By 3 in the afternoon, 3 separate hostesses had cancelled their invitations to the Voss family home on Aldgate Street. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with the careful efficiency of people rearranging their lives around a problem they had decided was not their own. Alara heard about it from her maid, Dot, who had heard it from the baker's boy, who had heard it from a footman at the Percival house 2 streets over. Dot was 17, and honest to a fault. She stood in the doorway of Alara's dressing room with wide eyes, and said simply, "They're saying you've gone and done something terribly unwise, miss." Alara looked at herself in the mirror. She was 23 years old, her hair was brown, and her eyes were gray, and she had a small scar near her left ear, from a fall at age 9, and there was nothing about her face that had ever caused a room to go quiet. She did not have the kind of beauty that London rewarded. She had something quieter than that. She had a stillness that people sometimes mistook for shyness and sometimes mistook for coldness, when in truth, it was neither. It was the expression of a woman who had spent a long time listening and had decided that most of what she heard was not worth interrupting. She said, "What time did the letter arrive?" Dot blinked. "Which letter?" "The one from the Duke's solicitor." "7:30 this morning, miss." "Then the Gazette had it by 8. Alara set down her hairbrush. "That's faster than I expected." She did not say anything else about it. She dressed, ate her breakfast, and went downstairs to find her father seated at the dining table, with a letter open in front of him, and a look on his face that she recognized. It was the look he wore when he was preparing to apologize for something that could not be undone. Her father, George Voss, was a man of considerable intelligence and modest fortune. He had spent 30 years as a naturalist and published 2 books that were well regarded in academic circles and entirely unknown anywhere else. He loved Alara with the specific, helpless love of a father who knows his daughter is better than the life he has been able to provide her. He had arranged this marriage in secret with the Duke's solicitor over a period of 6 weeks, and he had done it because a doctor had told him, in October, that his heart was failing, and that he had perhaps 2 years left to live. He had not told Alara any of this. "Sit down," he said. "I am sitting. I know, I need a moment." She gave him the moment. Outside, a carriage went past on the wet cobblestones, and the sound of the horses was very loud in the silence of the room. "The Duke of Ashmore," her father said finally, "is not a well man." "I know," Alara said. He looked up sharply. "You know?" "I know what the newspapers have said. I know what happened to the last household physician. I know his estate has not hosted a dinner in 4 years. I know he was supposed to marry Charlotte Halley last spring, and the engagement was broken off without explanation, 3 days before the ceremony." She folded her hands on the table. "I know all of that, father." George Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And you're still going?" "I'm still going." "Alara, you are ill," she said, not unkindly, just directly. "I worked that out in November, when you stopped eating meat and started leaving your study door open at night. You never used to do that." She looked at him steadily. "I am not angry. I understand why you arranged this without telling me. You thought I would refuse." He had the grace to look ashamed. "Would you have?" She considered that honestly. "I don't know," she said, "but I wouldn't have refused for the reasons you think." The thing London did not understand about Alara Voss, and would not take the time to learn, was that she was not an ordinary young woman navigating ordinary choices. She had grown up in a house where the lights sometimes burned all night, not because of celebration, but because her mother, Agnes Voss, could not sleep, could not, some nights, stop talking, could not, on worse nights, be persuaded that the things she saw in the corners of the room were not real. Agnes Voss had died 4 years ago, in the kind of quiet institution that good families used when they needed to make a problem disappear. She had been 39 years old. She had once been, by all accounts, a woman of tremendous warmth and considerable wit. Alara remembered the warmth, She had spent a great many years watching the wit dissolve into something else, something that the doctors named badly and treated worse, and that had taken her mother piece by piece, in a way that no one in the family was ever permitted to discuss in company. What that experience had given Alara was not bitterness, though she had earned it. It had given her something more practical, an education in suffering. She knew how it moved. She knew how it sounded. She knew the difference between a man who was broken and a man who had simply never been given the right conditions to hold himself together. She had spent her entire life learning to see that difference, and what she had heard about Julian Cavendish, Duke of Ashmore, had told her, with the quiet certainty of someone reading a map, exactly what she was looking at. That did not mean she was not frightened. She was. Quite enormously frightened, if she was being precise about it. But fear, in Alara's experience, was not a reason to stop. Fear was information. It told you something important was happening, and that you should pay attention. She had learned to pay attention. The engagement announcement had been published without any ceremony or social gathering, which was itself a comment. When a Duke of Ashmore's standing announced a match, there were usually dinners, there were usually introductions, there were usually careful performances staged for the benefit of society, that allowed everyone to agree to a fiction that made the whole business feel warmer than it was. There was none of that. The announcement appeared, cold and procedural, and then there was silence. Alara went about her week. She visited the lending library on Cannon Street. She finished copying her father's field notes from his last expedition, the one he had made 3 years ago, before the cough began. She took her usual walk along the embankment on Thursday morning, and she bought bread from the same baker she always bought bread from, and she exchanged the same polite nothings with the same neighbors she had always exchanged them with. Most of those neighbors, she noticed, had begun to speak to her with a particular quality in their voices, a sort of gentle, preemptive pity, as if they were already preparing their responses to news that had not yet arrived. Mrs. Pelham, from number 16, stopped her at the garden gate and said, with tremendous feeling and absolutely no useful content, "My dear girl, if there is anything at all that I can do." Alara thanked her and kept walking. The first time she saw Julian Cavendish was at a meeting arranged by his solicitor, a grave man named Hartwell, who wore his grief for the entire situation on his face, like a second coat. The meeting took place in a narrow office near Lincoln's Inn, in a room that smelled of old paper and coal smoke. Hartwell had laid out the terms of the marriage agreement on a long table and had been prepared, Alara suspected, to walk her through each clause with the pained thoroughness of a man expecting objections. She did not object to any of it. She read every page and signed where she was told to sign, and then she looked up and found that the man who had come in late and sat at the far end of the table without introducing himself was watching her. Julian Cavendish was 31 years old. He was tall, lean in the way of men who forgot to eat more often than they remembered, and he had the kind of face that would have been very handsome if it had not been so completely still. Not calm, still. The way a pool of water goes still in winter, when everything underneath it has stopped moving. He wore dark clothing, and he sat with the careful precision of a man who had learned to make sure his body did not betray him. His hands, which were folded on the table in front of him, were perfectly steady. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him. He said, "You read the entire document." "Yes," she said. "Most people don't. I find that the things people skip are often the most important." Something moved briefly across his face. Not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one. He said nothing else for the rest of the meeting. She thought about that afterward. She thought about the quality of his stillness, and the way his eyes had moved when he spoke to her, alert, despite everything, and deeply tired. She had seen that combination before. She knew what it cost a person to stay that present, when the weight they were carrying would have flattened most people entirely. She did not tell anyone what she thought. There was no one to tell, really. Her father was too guilty to be a useful confidant on this subject. Dot would have been sympathetic and entirely useless, and the women of her acquaintance, the ones who had not yet canceled their calls, would have nodded and said, "Yes, quite," and then repeated everything back to their mothers that same evening. So she kept it herself, as she kept most things. The wedding was small and practical, and attended by people who were there out of obligation rather than warmth. The church was lovely, at least. A quiet church in the city, with a stone floor worn smooth by centuries of feet and windows that let in light without making it into spectacle. Elara wore a dress that had taken her 3 weeks to make herself, which no one knew, and no one would have cared about if they did. It was cream-colored and well-fitted, and she thought it was rather beautiful, though she did not say so. Julian stood at the altar, with the uprightness of a soldier and the expression of a man attending his own trial. He said the words when they were required of him. He did not look at her much during the ceremony, but once, when the minister spoke about the nature of commitment, about the choice two people make to stay, he turned his head and looked directly at her, and there was something in that look that she did not have a word for yet. Something that was not hope, because he did not appear to be a man who used that word easily. Something underneath hope, perhaps. Something older and more cautious. She held his gaze for a moment, then the minister continued, and they both looked forward again. Afterward, in the carriage that took them from the church, they sat on opposite sides of the seat, with a careful distance between them. London moved past the window, gray and wet and full of itself. Julian looked out at the street. Elara looked at her hands. "I should tell you," he said finally, without turning from the window, "that I instructed Hartwell to arrange a private suite for you at the estate. You will have your own rooms and your own schedule. You will not be expected to attend me." "I see," Elara said. "I am told you have your father's botanical interests. The estate has grounds. You may use them." "That's very considerate." He turned to look at her then, briefly. "I am not trying to be considerate," he said. "I am trying to be honest. This arrangement suits a particular set of practical needs. I don't want you to have expectations that I cannot meet." Elara looked at him steadily. "What expectations do you think I have?" He seemed, for just a moment, uncertain, which was the first human thing she had seen from him, and she filed it away carefully. "Most women," he began. "I am not most women," she said, not sharply. "Just as a fact, the way you would state that the sky was gray or that it was November." He looked at her for another moment, then he turned back to the window. "No," he said quietly, as if confirming something to himself. "I don't suppose you are." The carriage rolled on through the wet London streets, and neither of them spoke again until they reached the station. But the silence between them had shifted, slightly, from the silence of two strangers to the silence of two people who were at least certain they were in the same room. It was not much, but Elara had learned, a long time ago, to begin with what was actually there, not with what she wished were there, and she thought, looking at the reflection of the Duke of Ashmore in the rain-streaked carriage window, that what was actually there was more than anyone in that church had given either of them credit for. She straightened her back and watched England go past the window, green and cold and very quiet. She had made her choice. She intended to keep it. Behind her, in the church they had just left, 3 women were already composing the letters they would send tomorrow, describing the new Duchess of Ashmore in terms that were kind in surface and devastating underneath. The letter that traveled fastest was written by a woman named Cecily Ormond, who had expected her own niece to make the match, and who described Elara as a plain, bookish creature with unfortunate family history and no apparent understanding of the position she has stepped into. Cecily Ormond was wrong about all of it, but she would not find that out for quite some time. On the train north, as the city thinned into fields and the sky opened up above the flat winterland, Elara opened the small notebook she always carried and wrote one line. It said, "Begin with what is real." She underlined it twice. Then she put the notebook away and looked out the window at England passing, and she did not let herself be afraid until she was certain no one was watching. Then she let herself be afraid for exactly 4 minutes. Then she stopped. Ashmore Park was visible from the road for nearly a mile before you reached it, which Elara thought was the kind of thing that was either impressive or ominous depending on your circumstances. In her case, she had not yet decided. The house rose from the Wiltshire landscape like something that had grown there naturally, all gray stone and tall chimneys and windows that caught the winter light and gave very little back. It was the kind of house that had been beautiful once and had not been tended. Not neglected exactly. The grounds were maintained, the path was clear, the gatehouse was clean and staffed. But there was a quality to it that she recognized. It was the quality of a place that had been managed without being loved. She had seen it in her father's study, near the end, when he stopped buying new books and began simply stacking things. The room still functioned. It simply no longer breathed. The carriage stopped. A line of household staff waited outside the main entrance in the cold, ordered and still, their breath coming out in small clouds in the evening air. The housekeeper stepped forward first, a woman of perhaps 60, with a strong face and careful eyes, who introduced herself as Mrs. Partridge. She shook Alara's hand, the way you shake the hand of someone you are genuinely glad to see, which was unexpected enough that Alara nearly said something about it.
"Welcome, Your Grace," Mrs. Partridge said. The title sat oddly on Alara's ears, but she accepted it without flinching.
Julian had stepped out of the carriage ahead of her. He exchanged a few words with his head man, Cobb, in a low voice, and then he looked back at Alara, with the expression of someone remembering they had a responsibility they had temporarily forgotten. "Mrs. Partridge will show you your rooms," he said. "Dinner is at 7 if you want it. You don't have to come down." She noticed that he did not say we when he talked about dinner. She noticed the rooms at the east end of the upper floor that had curtains drawn at the windows, though every other window in the house was uncurtained. She noticed that Mrs. Partridge's eyes followed the Duke as he walked inside, and that the look in them was not resentment or coldness, but something very much like worried love. She stored all of it and followed Mrs. Partridge inside. Her rooms were large, which she had not expected, and someone had put a fire on and fresh flowers on the desk, which she had expected even less. "That was my doing," Mrs. Partridge said, noticing Alara looking at them. "His Grace wouldn't have thought of it. I hope you don't mind." "They're beautiful," Alara said. "Thank you." Mrs. Partridge nodded, satisfied, and Alara saw her relax by a fraction, the way people do when they realize you are not, after all, going to make things difficult. "Dinner will be sent up if you'd prefer," the older woman added. "I'll come down," Alara said. "Thank you." She did come down. Julian was not at dinner. She ate alone in the large dining room, with Cobb standing at a respectful distance, and the sound of the wind outside the tall windows, and she thought, this is where it starts. Not in the city, not in a church. Right here, with a dinner she ate alone, in a room built for 30. She was not discouraged. She had known it would not be easy. She had simply not known yet the specific form the difficulty would take. She was about to find out. The first thing Alara discovered about Ashmore Park was that it ran on silence. Not the comfortable silence of a house at rest, but the practiced silence of a household that had learned not to make noise. The servants moved through the corridors with a quietness that went beyond training. They did not speak in the hallways. They did not gather in the kitchen in the way that kitchen staff usually did. Even the sounds that a house naturally made, the creak of floors, the rattle of coal being shifted, the distant closing of a door, seemed muted here, as if the house itself had agreed to be careful. Alara noticed this on her second morning. She had slept better than she expected, in the large bed in her rooms, and she had woken early with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after an anxious night that ends in unexpected rest. She dressed without ringing for Dot. Dot had been permitted to come with her, which had been Alara's one firm request in the negotiations, and Dot was at this moment still asleep down the corridor, which was entirely reasonable. Alara had learned to dress herself at 12 years old when the household began needing her hands elsewhere, and she had never stopped. She walked the east corridor to find the stairs to the garden. She passed 3 doors. 2 of them were simply rooms. She could tell by the quality of the silence inside them, which was the soft vacancy of unused space. The 3rd door, at the very end of the corridor, where the carpet changed to bare stone, had a different quality. It was locked. She could see the keyhole and the absence of a knob on her side, and the silence behind it was not empty. It had weight. She stood in front of that door for a moment, then she went downstairs. The garden in winter was a complicated thing. Parts of it had been maintained in the bare, geometric way of estates that employed gardeners out of duty rather than love. Hedges trimmed to their shapes, gravel paths raked. But at the edge of the formal garden, where the grounds gave way to something wilder, there was evidence of what the garden had once been. The skeleton of a rose arch, the dead stems of what she identified as a substantial lavender border, a line of old apple trees that had not been properly pruned in years, but still had the structure of a plan someone had loved once. She spent 2 hours out there in the cold, walking slowly and looking at things. She took notes. She had brought her notebook, as she always did, and she wrote down the things she saw with the careful precision her father had taught her. Not just what was there, but what had been there, and what could be, given the right conditions and enough time. Julian Cavendish appeared at the edge of the garden at 10:30. He was dressed as if he had been awake for hours, or possibly had not slept at all. It was difficult to tell, because he wore both states with the same careful blankness. He looked at her standing among the dead lavender with her notebook, and her outdoor coat, and her sensible boots, and he had the expression of a man encountering something that had not been in his plans. "You're outside," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's February." "I'm aware." He looked at the notebook in her hand. "What are you doing?" "Cataloging the garden." A pause. He moved closer, not warmly, but not with hostility either, with the careful approach of someone who has learned not to assume. He looked at what she had written over her shoulder. His face did not change, but she had the sense of something behind it shifting slightly, some small internal adjustment. "You know plants," he said. "My father is a naturalist. I've been his assistant since I was 8. Hartwell didn't mention that. Hartwell didn't ask. She turned a page. "This rose arch, do you know when it was planted?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother planted it," he said, "the year I was born." "I thought so. The rootstock is about 30 years old. It could be brought back." She did not say anything else about it. She did not need to. She simply wrote it down. Julian watched her write. Then he said, unexpectedly, "Are you cold?" "A little." "There's a fire in the library." She looked up at him. He looked back at her, with the expression of a man who had surprised himself, and was uncertain whether to acknowledge it. She decided to make it easy. "Thank you," she said. "I'll come in shortly." He nodded, once, and walked back to the house. She watched him go. His stride was controlled, even, careful in the way that people are careful when they have learned to distrust their own bodies. She had seen her mother walk that way, toward the end, every step a small negotiation. She finished her notes and went inside. The library at Ashmore Park was a room that had clearly been built with love and then left to its own devices. The shelves ran from floor to ceiling on 3 walls and held more books than Alara had ever seen in a private collection. They were not arranged for display. They were arranged the way someone's books are arranged when that person actually reads them, in clusters of subject, with notes tucked between spines, with a leather chair positioned close to the window at exactly the right angle for afternoon light. Someone had lived inside this room. The dust told her no one had done so in a while. There was a fire, as Julian had said. She sat next to it with a book from the nearest shelf, A Natural History of the British Isles, which she had been meaning to read for years. And she read for an hour. Julian did not appear in the library. But at 11 o'clock, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside that paused at the library door, stayed there for perhaps 30 seconds, and then moved away again. She looked up from her book at the door. It did not open. She went back to her reading. This was the pattern of those early days. Julian existed in the house the way weather exists. You knew he was there. You felt the effects of him, but contact was indirect and rarely lasted. He would appear in the dining room for a meal and then leave before it ended. He would cross the entrance hall just as Alara was coming down the stairs, acknowledge her with a nod, and be gone. Once she found him standing in the garden at dusk, quite still, looking at the rose arch. When she appeared in the doorway, he turned and went inside without a word. She did not try to follow. She had learned, long ago, that pursuit only taught people to run faster. You had to make the space comfortable enough that they came to it themselves. Mrs. Partridge, who had constituted herself as Alara's chief source of warmth in the household, began appearing at her rooms in the mornings, on the pretext of reviewing the day's household plans. Alara quickly understood that these visits were not primarily about household management. They were Mrs. Partridge's way of checking on her, assessing, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been watching over this house and its occupant for a very long time, whether the new Duchess was holding up. Alara passed these assessments, she thought, adequately. She was steady. She asked sensible questions. She did not complain about the cold or the isolation, or the particular loneliness of a house that did not quite feel like it belonged to you. On the 5th day, she asked Mrs. Partridge about the East Wing. The reaction was informative. The older woman's face did not change expression exactly, but a stillness moved across it. The same practiced stillness Alara had seen on the face of the household generally. "The East Wing is the Duke's private rooms," Mrs. Partridge said, carefully. "We don't go up there." "Who does?" A pause. His Grace manages things up there himself. I see, Alara said. And she did see. She saw quite a lot from that short exchange. She did not push further, not yet. She began instead to learn the house. She did this systematically, which was the only way she knew how to do things, starting from the ground floor and working her way through every room that was accessible to her, noting what was there, what it told her, what questions it raised. It was the same method she had used with her mother's illness, years ago. Build a picture from evidence before drawing conclusions, because conclusions drawn without enough evidence are just fears wearing the costume of certainty. The picture that emerged from Ashmore Park was of a house that had been, not long ago, a living thing. There were signs of it everywhere. The deep indentations in the leather of the library chair that told you someone had sat there regularly, for years. The marks on the nursery windowsill where small hands had rested. A music room that contained a very fine piano, with sheet music still open on the stand, as if the player had simply stepped out to fetch something and not come back. On the sheet music stand, she found a pencil note in the margin. It said, "Start slower, you keep rushing the middle." She looked at the handwriting for a long time. It was confident, slightly impatient, and entirely unguarded. It was the handwriting of someone who had been happy when they wrote it. She closed the music and left the room. That evening, at dinner, Julian came down and sat at the table and actually ate something, which Mrs. Partridge, hovering in the kitchen corridor, later told Alara was not a thing that happened every evening. He did not say much. He asked her how she was finding the library, which told her that he knew she had been in there. She told him she had found the natural history section particularly well stocked, and that someone had clearly read all of it, rather than simply collecting it. "My father," he said. "He had good taste." Julian looked at his plate. "Yes," he said. "He did." She did not pursue it. The subject of his father settled between them like something fragile, and she left it there. But she noticed that after she showed him she could be trusted with the fragile things by not picking them up carelessly, something in his presence at the table changed. Just slightly. Just enough. He stayed for the full dinner. It was a small thing. She had learned not to underestimate small things. Small things, in her experience, were how everything important began. She went to bed that night with the wind off the Wiltshire hills pushing at the windows, and she lay in the dark and thought about the pencil note in the margin of the sheet music. "Start slower, you keep rushing the middle." She thought that whoever had written it had been speaking about more than the piano. She closed her eyes and let the house settle around her, all its silences and its locked rooms and its carefully managed grief. She was here now. She was not going anywhere. Whatever was inside this house, she was going to learn it. Not to fix it, not to save it, just to understand it. The way you understand a landscape before you put a spade in the ground. You look at it first. You respect what's already there. You work with what exists, not with what you wish had been planted differently by someone before you. She had a great deal of looking left to do. She intended to do all of it. Outside, the wind moved through the dead lavender and the bare rose arch, and the house creaked once, deeply, like something taking a long breath. Then it went quiet again. It was always so very quiet. 2 weeks into her time at Ashmore Park, Alara found the journal. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a draft stopper for the narrow gap under the east library window, which let in a cold finger of air that no amount of thick curtain could fully block. She moved the andiron, looked behind the fireplace grate, and found it wedged in the gap between the back of the grate and the stone. A small notebook, bound in green cloth, its cover stained with what appeared to be fireplace dust, and something that might have been ink. She pulled it out carefully. The cover had no label. Inside, the handwriting was neat and slightly old-fashioned, which placed it at perhaps 15 to 20 years ago. She did not read past the first line on the first page, which told her the journal belonged to a woman named Catherine, which was the name of the first Duchess of Ashmore, Julian's mother. She held it for a long moment. Then she opened it again, because she needed to know if the journal contained anything that might help her understand what had happened in this house. Not out of curiosity, but out of the same practical necessity that had once driven her to read every book she could find on her mother's condition. Because information was the only tool she had, and she was not willing to work without tools. Most of it was ordinary. Household notes, social engagements, observations about the garden that made Ilara's chest ache with recognition. This was the woman who had planted the rose arch, who had planned the lavender border, who had seen what this garden could be. There were entries about the two boys, Julian and his younger brother, written with the vivid, unself-conscious love of a mother who did not imagine anyone else would read her words. The entries that were not ordinary were near the end. They were quieter, shorter. The handwriting changed slightly, still neat, but with a tremor in some letters that had not been there earlier. The tone changed too. The warmth was still present, but underneath it something else had begun to move, like a current under still water. The last entry was dated December, 7 years ago. Catherine Cavendish had written it in a hand that was still careful, but carried the weight of someone writing from the far edge of exhaustion. She had written about her elder son, Julian, though she did not name him directly. She had written about the way his face had changed in the months since a particular series of events she referenced but did not explain. She had written about trying to reach him and finding something in the way, not his deliberate resistance, but something prior to deliberate resistance, something that operated below the level of choice. The last sentence was the one that stopped Ilara entirely. Catherine Cavendish had written, "He cannot be reached. God help whoever comes next." Ilara read it twice. Then she set the journal on the library table and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire for a long time. She did not feel the despair the words might have been expected to produce. She felt something more complicated than that. She felt the particular grief of recognizing a woman who had loved someone very much and had not known what to do with that love when the person she loved became unreachable. She felt the recognition of a woman who had tried and finally written down the honest truth of her exhaustion. She did not agree with the conclusion. She did not think it was permanent, but she understood how someone could arrive at it. She closed the journal. She placed it in the drawer of the writing desk. She would not leave it out, because it was not hers to leave out. It was a private thing, and she would treat it with the care that private things deserved. But she had read it, and she would not pretend she had not. The door of the library opened and Julian came in. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the writing desk, and then at her face, and there was a moment, very brief, very still, in which something passed between them that was not quite accusation and not quite question. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved to the drawer, and she understood that he knew the journal existed, that he had probably known exactly where it was. She met his eyes and said nothing. He said nothing either. After a moment he walked to the window and stood looking out at the dark garden. "There was a time," he said, very quietly, "when this house was full of noise." "I know," Ilara said, because she did know. She had seen the evidence of it everywhere. "It happened gradually," he said. "Things go quiet gradually, and then one day you look up and the quiet is all there is, and you cannot quite remember when the noise stopped." She did not tell him what she had read. She did not need to. She said, "Does the quiet suit you?" He turned from the window. His face in the firelight was older looking than his years, carved by something that had been working on it for a long time. "No," he said. And then, as if surprised by his own honesty, he looked away. It was the most genuine thing he had said to her. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that might break, and she did not press further. She simply said good night, and she went upstairs. And behind her, in the library, the fire kept burning, and the Duke of Ashmore stood at the window for a long time after she had gone. It was Mrs. Partridge who finally said it aloud. 3 weeks after Ilara's arrival at Ashmore Park, on a Tuesday morning, when the frost lay thick on the garden, and the kitchen fire had been burning since 5, the old housekeeper came to Ilara's sitting room with the household accounts, and set them on the table, and then stood with her hands clasped, and said, without preamble, "You've noticed." Ilara looked up from the letter she was writing to her father. "Tell me what I've noticed," she said. Mrs. Partridge sat down in the chair across the table, an act that, in itself, was informative. Housekeepers did not generally sit in the presence of the mistress of the house, unless invited. Ilara had not invited her. The sitting down was a declaration of something more equal than that, and Ilara respected it. "His Grace," Mrs. Partridge said. "The episodes." "Yes," Ilara said, "I've noticed. It began 6 years ago." The older woman's voice was steady. She had clearly been rehearsing this. "After Mr. Edmund died, that's the Duke's younger brother, Edmund." A pause. The name sat heavily between them. Before that, the Duke he was different. Not easy, no. He was never easy. But he was present. He came down for meals. He managed the estate. He rode out with the tenants. She smoothed the hem of her apron. After, it was as if something inside him simply stopped. What happened to Edmund? Alara asked. A debt, Mrs. Partridge said carefully. More than one. Edmund was young, and he had ideas about investment that were not wise. And he had a way of making other people believe in them too, because he believed in them himself, so completely that you couldn't doubt him while he was talking. A faint expression moved across her face. He was that kind of person. You loved him because he made you feel that everything was possible. She stopped. The debt became very bad. A man was involved. A moneylender. The sort of man who does not wait patiently. Alara was still. She had heard this story in outline. The gossip had provided some of it. The newspaper archives had provided a little more, and the gaps she had filled with reasonable inference. She had not known Edmund's name until this moment. The Duke tried to settle the debt, Mrs. Partridge continued. He had the money, he sent it with Cobb, but there was a misunderstanding. A delay. I don't know the details exactly, and I don't think anyone does. And Edmund. She stopped again, her hands tightened in her lap. Edmund made a choice that night, a permanent one. He did not wait for the money to arrive. The room was very quiet. And the Duke arrived, Alara said softly, an hour later. Mrs. Partridge looked at her. Yes. A long exhale. He found his brother himself. He sent everyone else away, and he sat with him for 3 hours, and he would not let anyone in, and when he came out, he was already gone, in his way, already as far from us as he has been ever since. Alara sat with this. She let it settle. She did not rush past it or around it or away from it. She had learned, from years of sitting with her mother's worst hours, that grief needed to be stayed with, not resolved. The physician, she said finally. There was a physician who left the estate. Mrs. Partridge nodded. Dr. Farrow. He lasted 2 years. He was a good man, I think. He prescribed things that helped for a time, and then didn't help. And he increased the doses, and things got worse. The Duke stopped eating. He stopped leaving the house. He was not well, ma'am. Truly not well. In ways I did not have words for then. She paused. I have some words for it now. I've done some reading. Alara looked at the older woman with renewed attention. What have you read? Whatever I could find. Mrs. Partridge met her gaze directly. When you are responsible for someone, and you do not understand what is happening to them, you find books. You find words. You find other people who have written about the same darkness, because at least then, you know it has happened before. At least then, it is not incomprehensible. No, Alara said. It is not incomprehensible. Something shifted in Mrs. Partridge's face. You know it, she said. Not a question. My mother was ill. Not in the same way, but similarly placed. Somewhere that other people could not reach. She looked at her folded hands. I know what it looks like from the outside. And from the inside too, in a way. The person trying to get in. The two women sat with that between them for a moment. Outside, the winter garden was perfectly still, all bare branches and frost-stiffened grass, and the sky above it was the flat, gray, unbothered white of February. Then Mrs. Partridge said, What are you going to do? It was a remarkable question to be asked by a housekeeper, and they both knew it. Alara considered it seriously, which was the only way she considered things. I'm going to stop the laudanum first, she said. Not all at once, gradually. He's been using it to manage the worst of it, but it's also making the worst of it worse. The physicians all know this, and none of them say it clearly enough. Mrs. Partridge absorbed this without surprise, which told Alara the older woman had read the same passages she had. Then, Alara continued, I'm going to establish a routine, meals, sleep, light, air. In that order. Those 4 things above everything else. The body needs to be made as steady as possible before the mind can do anything with what's in it. She paused. It won't be quick, and he won't like it. He's going to resist it, and he's going to be difficult, and there will be days when it appears to be going in the wrong direction entirely. Yes, said Mrs. Partridge. But I am not going to stop. The older woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Alara did not expect. I knew, when Hartwell wrote to me and said there was to be a marriage, that it was because the Duke would not survive another winter on his own. I did not know what kind of woman would come. A small, careful pause. I am glad it was you. Alara accepted this without deflecting it. Thank you, she said. I'll need your help. You have it, Mrs. Partridge said simply. That afternoon, Alara went looking for Julian. She found him in the study on the ground floor, a room she had not yet entered because its door had always been closed, and the convention of the household was clear. That room was his. She knocked and did not wait to be invited. She opened the door and stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides. Julian was at the desk. In front of him was a glass. On the desk beside the glass was a bottle, and it was not wine. He looked at her. His eyes were not clear. They were the eyes of someone who had been drinking since morning, not to the point of incapacity, but to the point where the edges of the world had been filed down to something more manageable. She had seen that particular quality of look before too. You didn't knock, he said. I did, she said. You didn't hear me. He looked at the glass, then at her. Something moved in his expression. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance, something between them. Do you need something? Yes, she said. I need to talk to you about your health. A silence. He set the glass down. My health is my own business. As the Duchess of Ashmore, your health is at least partially my business, she said, not unkindly. And I'm not saying this as a matter of title. I'm saying it because I live in this house, and I have eyes, and I have been paying attention for 3 weeks. He looked at her steadily. His expression had the quality of a wall. Present, complete, designed to keep things on the correct sides of it. And what, he said, do you think you've understood, in 3 weeks? She did not answer right away. She moved into the room, which surprised him. She could see it in the slight shift of his posture, and she sat down in the chair across from the desk, the way Mrs. Partridge had sat down that morning, as an equal rather than a supplicant. I think, she said, that you have been in a great deal of pain for a very long time. I think the people who were supposed to help you did not know how, and some of them made things worse rather than better. I think you have been managing something enormous by yourself, with tools that aren't working, and I think you are exhausted in a way that goes down to your bones. She paused. I don't think you are beyond help. I think you have been beyond the specific help that was being offered. Julian looked at her. His face was very still. I'm not afraid of what you are, she said. It was the same thing she had said weeks ago, in a different context. She meant it the same way both times. You should be, he said. It was quiet and honest, and not theatrical. He meant it. I'm not, she said. I grew up in the shadow of something like this. I know what it looks like. I know what it asks of the people around it. She looked at him steadily. It asks for consistency, for patience, for someone who doesn't leave when it gets difficult. I am very good at not leaving when things get difficult. A long moment passed. The fire in the study crackled. Outside, a branch moved in the wind, and its shadow crossed the window briefly. Julian said, What is it that you want, exactly? I want you to agree to try something, she said. Not medicine, not another physician, just a set of simple practices. Meals at the same time, sleep before midnight, time outside before noon. Less of that, she nodded at the bottle, not accusingly, and more of something else that we'll decide on together. That's it? For now, she said. We start with what's manageable. He was quiet for a very long time. The silence had that particular quality of a man standing at the edge of something, looking down, deciding. She did not fill it. She had learned that filling those silences was the worst possible thing you could do. You had to let the person stand at the edge and make the choice themselves. You could stand near them. You could make the ground feel less terrifying. But you could not push. Finally he said, This won't work. It might not, she said honestly. But it might. And the alternative is more of this. She looked at the glass, which is also not working. Something flickered in his expression. You're very direct, he said. Yes. Is that a problem? Another pause. No, he said slowly, as if finding that he meant it. No, I don't think it is. She nodded. Tomorrow. Breakfast at 8. In the dining room, he looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the glass. Then he stood up. walked to the window, and stood looking out at the garden. The dead garden, the bare bones of it, the frozen land. She waited. 8 o'clock, he said finally. She stood up. Thank you, she said, and she left the room. In the corridor outside, she stopped and let out a slow, controlled breath. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her skirt until they steadied. Then she went to find Mrs. Partridge and told her there would be 2 at breakfast tomorrow at 8, and to please make sure there was something warm and real and not too elaborate, because elaborate things were easier to refuse than simple ones, and what she needed tomorrow was for this man to eat. Just eat, just that one small thing. It was, she told herself firmly, a beginning. The next morning, at 7:55, Julian Cavendish came downstairs. He sat at the breakfast table. And he ate. What followed was not graceful. Alara had expected that. She had prepared herself for it in the way that you prepare yourself before walking into cold water, not by telling yourself it won't be cold, but by deciding in advance that the cold will not stop you. Julian was resistant. He was also, on certain days, deliberately difficult. He skipped the breakfast they had agreed on. He appeared for it 2 hours late without apology. He came down one morning, saw that she had brought a copy of his estate accounts to the table, and left the room entirely. He told her, on a particularly bad Thursday, that her presence in the house was an inconvenience, and that her method, he said the word with a specific, clipped contempt, was not something that would work on him, because he was not her mother. That one landed. She was honest enough to admit that it landed. She did not react. She finished her tea, set down her cup, and said quietly, "You're right, that you are not my mother. You are someone different, with a different kind of difficulty, and I have not confused the two." A pause. "I am sorry that your morning has been bad enough that you needed to say something designed to hurt." He stared at her. Then he sat back down at the table. He did not apologize. She had not expected an apology. She had expected exactly what happened, which was that he picked up his fork and, in silence, ate the rest of his breakfast. Progress, in this context, did not look like progress. It looked like a man eating a meal under sufferance. It looked like a person walking through the garden for 20 minutes in the gray light of a February morning, hands in pockets, expression closed, not speaking. It looked like small, unglamorous concessions, made not because the person making them was convinced they would help, but because the alternative was something they were too tired to continue. But Alara knew, because her father had taught her, and her mother had shown her in her own painful way, that this was how real change began, not in breakthroughs, not in moments of revelation, in the daily, unremarkable accumulation of small things. She reduced his laudanum. She did this quietly, with Mrs. Partridge's help, and without announcing it to Julian directly. She had considered whether this was right. She had decided it was, because the alternative, asking for his agreement while he was still in the grip of it, was like asking a drowning man to vote on swimming technique. The reduction was slow and careful. On the worst days of withdrawal, she sat nearby and offered nothing more than proximity, which was sometimes all there was to offer. On one of those days, the 11th day of the reduction, he looked at her from where he was sitting, collapsed in the library chair, pale, clearly miserable, and said, "Why are you still here?" "Because I said I would be," she answered. He closed his eyes. A long moment passed. "My mother thought I would recover from Edmund's death," he said, without opening them. "She sat with me, in the beginning, for months. She was patient. She was kind." He paused. "She wore out. Which is what people do. Which is what anyone reasonable would do." He opened his eyes and looked at the fire. "I don't expect you to be different. You don't have to expect anything," Alara said. "I'm not asking you to expect things. I'm asking you to eat breakfast and take a walk before noon." Something moved across his face that was almost, not quite, but almost, the beginning of something lighter. It vanished quickly, but it had been there. She noted it and said nothing. She was building something, here in this cold and quiet house, with these plain and unremarkable daily actions. She knew it would be a long time before the structure was visible from the outside. Structures always took longer than you expected from the inside. She wrote to her father every week. She did not tell him all of it. She told him enough to let him know she was well and purposeful. He wrote back letters that were shorter than they used to be, which she read for what they were. The letters of a man who was tiring, who was relieved she was somewhere safe, who did not want her to worry about him while she was worrying about everything else. She wrote, in one letter, "I think I may be more suited to this than I imagined." He wrote back, "I knew that before you left. I am sorry I did not ask you first whether you wanted to know it." She read that letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with her mother's journal. Not Catherine's, Agnes's, the one she had brought from home. 2 journals in a drawer. 2 women who had tried, each in their own way, to hold on to something that kept trying to disappear. She closed the drawer and went downstairs to make sure dinner was happening at the agreed time, in the agreed room, because the agreed time in the agreed room was the whole point right now, and she was not going to lose sight of the whole point for the sake of feelings. Feelings could come later. Structure first. That was the rule. She held to it. The walk became the hardest part to protect. Not because Julian refused it entirely. He did not refuse it entirely, which was itself a kind of victory, though a quiet one, but because the nature of the walk kept changing in ways that required constant adjustment. Some mornings he was too unwell to go out, and on those mornings, Alara adapted, suggesting a slow circuit of the entrance hall instead, which was large enough to feel like movement even on the worst days. Other mornings he was well enough to go out, but went with the specific quality of a man serving a sentence, head down, shoulders forward, feet moving, but the rest of him absent. On those mornings she went with him and talked. Not about him, not about the dark things. She had learned, watching her mother, that the dark things did not benefit from being spoken about directly when a person was in the middle of them. Addressing the darkness head-on, when someone was standing inside it, was like shining a very bright light into a space that had been dark for a long time. You needed to let the eyes adjust first. So she talked about the garden. She talked about what she intended to plant along the south-facing wall, and why that particular aspect would suit certain roses. She talked about a variety of lavender she had read about from the Provençal hills of France, which was hardier than the English type and flowered earlier in spring. She talked about the apple trees and the pruning they needed, and the particular satisfaction of shaping a tree that would outlive the person who shaped it. Julian listened. She knew he listened because his pace changed. When she was talking, he walked a little less like a man walking away from something. When she stopped, he sometimes walked a little faster again, as if the absence of sound reminded him of things he did not want to be reminded of. So she kept talking. She did not talk all the time. She had also learned that was wrong. That constant filling of silence was its own kind of pressure, and people who were already under pressure did not need more. She learned the rhythm of it. Talk for a while. Let it rest. Speak again, when the silence had moved from comfortable to the edge of uncomfortable. It took 3 weeks to learn that rhythm, with Julian specifically. He did not make it easy. On the 4th week of the walks, he stopped in the middle of the south path and turned to face her and said, "You've been very careful with me." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It's deliberate," he said. "Yes," she said again. He studied her. "You were trained for something like this." "Not trained," she said. "Shaped by experience. There's a difference." "Your mother," he said. He did not say it as a question. He said it the way you acknowledge something you already know. "Yes." He looked at the bare garden. The first small signs of spring had begun to appear in the beds she had been clearing. Not flowers, not yet. Just the very early pushing of things below the soil making itself known in small, uncertain ways. "What was it like?" he asked. "For you, as a child?" She considered the question honestly. She had been asked it before, by various well-meaning people, and she had always deflected it. She found, standing here in the winter cold with this man who had himself been shaped by something enormous, that she did not want to deflect. "It was confusing at first," she said. "When you are small, and your mother is not well, you think it must be something about you. You think if you behave better, or are quieter, or are more careful, then whatever is happening will stop happening." She paused. "It took me until I was about 12 to understand that it had nothing to do with me, that it was a thing happening inside her that she could no more control than I could." Julian was listening. She could feel it. That was both a relief and not a relief, she continued. Because once you understood you were not causing it, you had to accept that you also could not stop it. And that is a different kind of helplessness. She looked at the bare apple trees. I chose to do something with it. I don't know if that was wisdom or just necessity. It felt more like necessity. Julian turned to look at her. In the thin February light, his face was clearer than she usually saw it. Less managed, less defended. The stillness was still there, but underneath it, today, something else was present. Something that was paying attention. You chose to become useful, he said. I chose to become someone who understood what was happening, she corrected gently. The usefulness followed from that. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he turned back to the path. Edmund, he said, and then stopped. She waited. Edmund was the kind of person, he said slowly, who made a room better, just by being in it. You know that kind of person? Not because he performed for rooms, because he genuinely. He paused, searching. He genuinely wanted good things to happen to people. He was not naive about the world. He understood how things worked. He simply refused to be changed by that understanding into someone harder. A long breath. I was always harder. I was always the sensible one. The Duke. The one who managed things. He paused. He was the one who made managing things feel worthwhile. Alara said nothing. She let him have the space. When he was gone, Julian said, the managing felt pointless, and I did not know what to do with that. I did not know what to do with any of it, and so I did nothing, which became the habit, which became this. He gestured, briefly and without drama, at himself. They stood on the path in the cold for a moment. He sounds like someone worth grief, Alara said. Julian looked at her sharply, surprised by the word. Then something shifted in his face, almost imperceptibly. Yes, he said. He was. It was the most he had said about Edmund in a single conversation. She did not react to it, as if it were a breakthrough. She reacted to it the way she reacted to the first small signs of things pushing up through the garden soil, with quiet attention, with the understanding that this was the beginning of something, and not the thing itself, and that the correct response was to not do anything dramatic that might frighten it back underground. Let's keep walking, she said. They did. That evening at dinner, something had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that someone watching from outside would have named as change. But Julian stayed at the table for an hour after they finished eating, and he refilled his own water glass rather than wine. And he asked Alara a question about the type of rose she had mentioned planting along the south wall. The question was specific. It was the question of someone who had been listening and had continued to think about what they heard even after the conversation had stopped. She answered it in detail, and he listened and asked another question. It was not conversation, as the world expected conversation, between a duke and his bride to look. There was nothing glamorous about it, but it was real, and it was present, and it was two people in the same room, genuinely engaged with the same subject, and that was something Alara had been building toward for weeks, without knowing exactly when it would appear. Later, when she went upstairs, she sat at her writing desk and did not write anything. She just sat and let herself feel the small warmth of the evening. Dot came in to turn down the bed and said, without preamble, as was her way, he seemed better tonight. A little, Alara said. More than a little, Dot said. Cobby told me the Duke hasn't sat at that table for an hour since, well, she smoothed a pillow, since a long time. Alara did not say anything. She did not want to assign too much significance to one good evening. She had learned, with her mother, that one good day could be followed by 3 very bad ones, and that the error was to let the good day make you unprepared for what came next. But she let herself feel it, just tonight, just this one good evening. It mattered. She knew it mattered. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, and somewhere in the bare earth along the south wall, just under the soil, things were deciding whether or not to come up. She thought they would. She was fairly certain they would. She went to bed with the particular quietness of a person who is doing something real and knows it, and she slept soundly for the first time in weeks, and when she woke in the morning, the frost on the window had a different quality to it. Not softer, not warmer, but lighter, somehow, as if the glass had decided to let a little more through. She got up. She dressed. She went downstairs at 7:45. At 8 o'clock, Julian came down. He sat at the breakfast table. He looked at her and said, "Good morning," which was the first time he had said it with any particular intention. "Good morning," she said. And there it was, the smallest thing, the thing that people who had not been paying close attention would have walked past entirely. She noticed it. She tucked it away, like the first cutting from a new plant, fragile, not yet rooted, but alive. She poured tea. He picked up his fork. The morning light came through the tall windows and sat quietly on the table between them. Outside, in the south bed, 3 inches below the cold soil, something green was pushing upward. The weeks that followed were, by any external measure, unremarkable. Alara had come to believe that unremarkable was vastly underrated as a condition of life. People searched endlessly for the dramatic, the transformative, the moment in which everything shifted. They overlooked what actually did most of the work. The steady, repeated application of small efforts in the right direction. She worked on the garden. She had recruited 2 of the estate's groundsmen, a quiet older man named Graves and his son, who had his father's way of working without needing to fill the air with words. And together, they began the slow work of restoring the south bed and the rose arch and the lavender border. She had written to a nursery in Kent that specialized in heritage varieties, and she spent her evenings reading the catalogs they sent, making careful selections. Julian began appearing at the edge of the garden on some afternoons. He did not offer to help. He did not comment on what she was doing. He stood at the edge, hands in his coat pockets, and watched. She did not make anything of this. She simply continued working, and spoke to him when it seemed natural, and did not speak when it did not. Graves and his son ignored him with the tactful invisibility of estate workers, who had long ago learned to be furniture when the family needed them to be. Once, Julian bent down and picked up a loose stake that had fallen from the temporary canes she was using to support a cutting, and set it back in the ground without saying anything. She thanked him without making anything of it. He nodded and kept watching. The following week he had gloves on when he came outside. She did not comment on the gloves. She simply said, when it seemed natural, "The lavender, cutting against the west corner, needs a stake. The wind keeps catching it." He staked it. He did it competently, which surprised her, and then she revised her surprise, because she remembered that this man had grown up on this land, that he had been here before the grief, that the hands had known this kind of work once. They worked in silence for an hour, then they went inside for tea. Something was forming between them. It did not have a name yet. It was not romance, not in any way the gossip columns of London would have recognized. It was more basic and more durable than that. It was the particular bond that forms between 2 people when they have stood together in the same difficult weather, long enough to know how the other one holds up. She trusted him, she realized. Not fully, not the way you trust someone after years, when the trust has been tested and held, but in the specific way of the garden. She trusted the direction. She trusted the soil. She trusted that what was being planted was going in roots first, which is the only way anything survives a winter. He began to ask her questions at dinner. Not about herself, not directly. He was too private for that, and she suspected that asking direct questions about people was still a thing he did not find natural. He asked about her father's work. He asked about the specific properties of different soils. He asked about a Latin phrase in the natural history book she had left on the library table, not because he needed to know it, she thought, but because asking the question was a way of staying in the room. She answered everything fully and carefully. She asked questions of her own, matching the register of his, practical, interested, not probing. She asked about the estate's history, the old tenants, the geography of the land. He knew all of it. He had grown up knowing it, and talking about it seemed to bring him back into contact with something in himself that had been at a distance. One evening in early March, she asked him about the East Wing. Directly this time, because she had decided the indirect route around that subject had been allowed enough time. He was quiet for a long moment. Not defensive. She had half expected defensive. More like someone deciding how much of themselves to offer, and where to put the offering down. "My brother's rooms," he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Partridge told me." He looked at his cup. "What else did she tell you?" "Most of it," Alara said honestly. He absorbed this. She watched for the wall to go up, for the careful blankness to replace whatever he had been showing her. It did not. He was quiet, but the quality of the quiet was different from his old quiets. It was more like the quiet of someone gathering themselves, rather than someone retreating. I haven't been able to go in there, he said. Since the first week. I went once, to close the windows, and I couldn't stay. I closed the windows, and I locked the door, and I gave the key to Cobb, and I told him to keep it, because if I had it I would. He stopped. You would go in, Ilara said. I don't know what I would do, he said, with the honest uncertainty of a man who was being truthful about the limits of his self-knowledge. I don't know what's in there for me. Whether it would help, or whether it would make things worse. He looked up. I have not been sure I could survive making things worse. Ilara held that statement very carefully. It was the most honest thing he had said about the scale of what he was managing. She did not give him the reassuring reply it might have seemed to invite, because reassurance that was not grounded in truth was not something she believed in, and he would not have believed it from her anyway. Not yet then, she said. There's no rule about when. He nodded slowly. No. But the key, she said. I think you should have it back. He looked at her. Why? Because Cobby having it means the choice is not yours, and you need the choice to be yours, for it to be something you did, not something that was done for you. She paused. When you're ready, not before. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You think about things very carefully. It's all I know how to do, she said honestly. Something moved across his face. Briefly, unmistakably. It was warmth. Not the performed warmth of social occasion, the real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind that appears on a face before the person has a chance to decide whether to show it. She received it quietly. She did not make a performance of receiving it. The next morning, the key to the east wing appeared on the table outside Julian's study door. He had asked Cobb to return it. She did not comment on this when she saw it. She simply walked past and noted, privately, that the key was there, and that it being there was exactly the right kind of step in exactly the right direction. She went to the garden. She planted lavender. She thought about how long it took lavender to establish itself, how it looked almost nothing in the first year, how you had to believe in what was under the soil, even when the surface gave you nothing to see. She believed in it. She always had. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, and it changed everything about that week, and several weeks that came after. It came from a firm of solicitors in London, not Hartwell, a different firm, older and colder in its manner, and it contained formal notification that one Gerald Holt, the final creditor linked to the chain of debt that had destroyed Edmund Cavendish, had died 3 days prior. His estate had been settled. The matter was, in legal terms, concluded. Julian read this letter in his study at 9 in the morning. Ilara did not know he had received it until Mrs. Partridge came to find her at the edge of the garden at 11:30, moving quickly in the way of someone who had been trying not to run. His Grace, Mrs. Partridge said, and stopped, and pressed her hands together. Her face told Ilara everything, before another word was spoken. Ilara set down her gloves and went. She did not go quickly. Not because she was not concerned. She was, entirely. But because she had learned that approaching a crisis at a run telegraphed panic to everyone in the vicinity, and panic was the last thing useful in a crisis. She walked firmly, and she kept her face clear, and when she reached the house, she paused in the entrance hall to take a single breath. Then she went up. Julian was not in his study. She tried the library, not there either. She stood in the corridor and listened with the particular listening she had developed over years of needing to locate someone who did not want to be located. Not a sound listening, but a quality of silence listening. And then she walked to the east wing. The door was not locked. It had not been locked since Cobb returned the key, but the door had remained closed, and no one had touched it. Now it stood open by 3 inches, light leaking from the gap. She pushed it open. The east wing hallway was narrow and faced north, with small windows that caught very little of the pale March sun. At the end of the hallway was another door, and this one was open fully. Light and cold air came through it. Someone had opened a window. She walked down the hallway and into the room. Edmund's room. She had been right about the quality of the silence behind that door. This room was full. Not full of objects, though there were those, all of them preserved in the careful stillness of a place that had not been touched. But full in the way that rooms are full when they have mattered to someone. Full in the way of a presence that has not quite left. Julian was standing at the open window, looking out over the north lawn. He did not turn when she came in. His hands were on the window frame. He was holding on to the frame, not dramatically, not with visible distress, but with the grip of someone who has decided that if they let go, they will have to be in the room without something to hold. She came in, and she closed the door behind her. She did not approach him. She sat on the floor near the door, directly on the floor, because there was no chair within reach, and she was not going to waste time dragging one from the corridor, and she said nothing. They were like that for several minutes. Then Julian said, "He owed Holt money because of me." She waited. "I had investments through a partnership," he said, his voice entirely level, which was the voice of someone keeping themselves level by deliberate effort. "Edmund asked to be included. I told him no, because I didn't think the risk suited him. He was not a patient investor. He needed to see results quickly, and this kind of partnership required years before you saw anything." He paused. He went to Holt instead. He went to a private lender to fund his own stake in a different venture entirely, one he had found himself, because he wanted to show me he could do it without my help. Another pause. The venture failed, and Holt was the kind of lender who did not give time. The cold March air came through the open window. Alara sat on the floor and listened. "If I had let him into my partnership," Julian said, "he would not have needed Holt. He would have been in something stable and slow and safe." He stopped. The grip on the window frame tightened briefly. "I said no, because I thought I was protecting him from his own impatience. I was protecting him from the one thing that would have kept him safe." The silence stretched. "I ran through this," he said. "Every version of it. Every different decision I could have made. The night he died, and every night since. For 6 years." His voice did not crack. It was too controlled for that. But the control itself was a kind of distress. You could hear the effort inside it, the enormous effort of keeping the voice level when the thing it was carrying was not level at all. "And I have never been able to make it stop." "You won't make it stop by running it," Alara said. He turned to look at her then. She was sitting on the floor with her back to the door, which was not a dignified position, and she was looking at him with the same directness she always used, not flinching from what she saw, not softening it, not performing sympathy at him, just looking at him. "Then how?" he said. "You don't stop it by running it," she said. "You stop running it by grieving Edmund. Actually grieving him. Not running the decisions. That's not grief, that's punishment. That's you giving yourself a sentence and making sure you serve it." She paused. "Edmund doesn't need you to serve a sentence. Edmund is gone. The only person being served by the sentence is your belief that suffering enough will eventually balance the account. It won't. There is no account. There is just your brother, and the fact that you loved him and he is gone." Julian looked at her for a long time. Something was happening in his face that she had not seen happen there before. Something was moving through it, like weather moving through a landscape that had been still so long it had forgotten how to move. "He loved you," she said. "He clearly loved you. A man who didn't love his brother would not have needed so badly to show him something." Julian turned back to the window. He was very still for a moment, and then he sat down on the floor. Not collapsed, not dramatically. He just sat down, with his back against the wall under the window, and his legs out in front of him, and his hands in his lap. He sat the way you sit when you have stopped fighting gravity. Alara stayed where she was by the door. She did not move toward him, and she did not move away. She sat on the cold floor of the east wing, and she did something she had not planned, and had not prepared, and was not strategic at all. She began to talk about her mother, not about the illness. About Agnes Voss before the illness, the woman she had been, the particular brightness of her, the things she had loved and the ways she had loved them. She talked about her mother's garden, smaller and less grand than this one, but tended with enormous specific care. She talked about the handwriting, neat and slightly slanted. She talked about the way she had laughed, which had been too loud for polite company, and entirely genuine. She talked about the particular way her mother had smelled of lavender water on Sunday mornings. She talked for a long time. Julian said nothing. He sat against the wall and listened. Eventually she said, "What was Edmund like? What was he like before all of it?" A silence, a long one, in which she could hear the wind moving over the north lawn, and somewhere below the estate, dogs shifting in their kennel. Julian said, "He was a great deal of noise." Alara looked at him. Something in his voice had changed, loosened, by a small but real degree. "Noise," she said. "Always talking. always moving. If he was in a room, you knew it within seconds, because the room changed. The temperature changed. The direction of things changed. A pause. He had an absolutely terrible singing voice, and he sang constantly. In the mornings especially. You could hear him from 3 rooms away. A breath that was not quite a laugh, but was the shape of one. It was infuriating. I told him so regularly. Did he stop? Never, Julian said. He said anyone who didn't want to hear him sing was welcome to leave. Another breath. That was almost a laugh. He meant it too. He was completely without embarrassment about it. He sounds wonderful, Alara said, and she meant it. He was, Julian said. The 2 words were simple, and they were enormous, and they were, finally, for the first time, said without the weight of punishment inside them. Said as a fact, about a person who had been loved. He was. They sat on the cold floor of the East Wing room, for a long time after that. Julian talked about his brother, small things, specific things, the particular things that only a person who was there would know. Alara listened. She asked questions when the silence stretched too long. She did not direct any of it. She just held the space open, and let him fill it with Edmund, in a way he had not been able to fill it in 6 years. It got dark outside. The light changed. Mrs. Partridge appeared at the door once, saw them both on the floor, and quietly withdrew. Dot appeared with 2 lamps, and set them in the room without a word. At some point Julian stood up and closed the window. He looked at the room for a moment, really looked at it, with his eyes, rather than with the avoidance that had kept it locked for years. He looked at the books on the shelf, the coat on the hook, the shoes by the wardrobe. He crossed the room and picked up the coat. He held it for a moment, then he hung it more carefully on the hook, the same position, the same place. But a deliberate act, rather than a preserved accident. A small difference, the kind of difference that separates grief from punishment. He turned to look at Alara. She was standing near the door. "Thank you," he said. "You would have found your way here without me," she said. "Sooner or later." "No," he said. He said it with a quietness that made it clear he had considered the question. "I don't think I would have." She nodded. She opened the door. They walked out of the East Wing together, and behind them, the lamps burned in Edmund's room, and the coat hung on the hook, and the night came in, through the closed window, in the way that night comes into rooms where people are beginning to live again. Down in the entrance hall, Cobby had left a lamp burning. Julian looked at it, and then he looked at Alara, and he said, with the first entirely unguarded expression she had seen on his face, "I'm hungry." "Good," she said. "Let's eat." They went to the dining room. Mrs. Partridge had kept dinner warm. They sat down at the table together, and they ate, and it was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet from the quiet of before, and anyone paying close enough attention would have known the difference. The house knew. Houses always know. After the night in the East Wing, something altered in the atmosphere of Ashmore Park. Not loudly, not in the kind of way that announced itself, but the house, which had run for years on the silence of a place where feeling had been very carefully managed, began to do something else. It began, in small and incremental ways, to breathe. Julian came down for breakfast without being reminded. He walked in the garden without needing to be accompanied. He began reading again, not just sitting in the library with a book open, which he had always done, but reading in the way you read when you are actually receiving what is on the page. She could tell the difference because he started mentioning things he had read. Not at length, not with any announcement. He would simply say, "At dinner, I read something interesting this afternoon," and then he would tell her what it was, and his face, while he told her, was not guarded. It was present. She held all of this with the same careful attention she had always held things, without making it precious, without marking it with ceremony. She understood that pointed out improvements often caused the person to self-consciously examine, and then worry about the improvement, which could interrupt it. She had learned this with her mother, in the 2 brief periods of wellness. The moment you said, "You seem so much better," the person heard, underneath the words, the anxiety about when it might stop. So she said nothing about better. She just lived alongside it. There was a morning in late April, with the garden genuinely beginning to show itself. The lavender not yet flowering, but green and growing. The rose arch budded with red-tipped shoots, when she came outside to find Julian already there. He had brought his coffee. He was standing at the edge of the south bed, looking at what had come up. She came and stood beside him. He said, I used to hate this garden. She looked at him. After my mother died, he said. She had planted everything in it, and for a long time I couldn't look at it because it was hers. It felt like something that was still talking in her voice when I didn't have the capacity to hear it. He sipped his coffee. Then I just stopped seeing it. It was easier. And now? She asked. He looked at the lavender, at the rose shoots, at the careful staking she and Graves had done along the south wall. Now, he said slowly, it's yours. She waited to see what he meant by that. I don't mean I've given it to you, he said, understanding her waiting. I mean it's yours in the way that things become yours when you've worked on them, changed them, put yourself into them. He paused. I can see it again now. The garden. I can look at it, and not. He stopped, and not have to brace myself. She looked at the lavender border. When my mother was dying, she said, I used to sit in my father's study, because it didn't have any of her things in it. It was the one room where I could breathe without being reminded. She paused. After she was gone, I couldn't go in his study at all, because then the association had changed. Julian looked at her. What happened to it? I eventually put a plant in there, she said. Something green and growing, that had nothing to do with anything that had happened. Something new. She looked at the rose shoots. The new thing gave me a reason to go in without the old weight. He was quiet. Then he said, Is that what you've been doing, in my garden? It's everyone's garden, she said, but, yes, something like that. He turned to look at her. The April morning light was good light for seeing a person clearly, and she let herself be seen, because she thought he had earned it. He looked at her with an expression that was not yet what it would eventually become, but was already several steps closer than anything she had seen from him in the months before. I owe you a very large apology, he said. She shook her head. You don't. The things I said, the morning I told you. I don't require an apology for things said in distress, she said. I require only that they are not the final words on the subject. She paused. Are they? He looked at her. No, he said, they are not. Then we're done with that, she said. Simply, firmly, without performance. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the garden. Tell me about the Provençal lavender again, he said, the variety that flowers early. She told him about it. He listened and asked questions, and while she was talking she thought, this is what hope actually looks like. Not the bright, declarative thing people imagine when they use the word, this. Two people standing in a cold April garden, talking about lavender, having survived a great many things and being, at this particular moment, all right. Just all right. It was the finest thing she could think of. They stood in the garden until the coffee was cold and the morning had fully committed to being morning, and then they went inside for breakfast and ate it side by side and talked about the plants and the estate and a book Julian had been reading, and outside, the lavender grew quietly in the direction of the sun. Later that day, Elara wrote to her father. She told him she was well. She told him the garden was coming in. She told him she had found a copy of his second book on the estate library shelf, which she had not expected, and that she thought the estate's previous owner had known what they were looking at when they purchased it. She did not tell him about the East Wing, or the letter about Gerald Holt, or the morning on the floor of Edmund's room. Those things were not hers to share. She simply told him she was well. Her father wrote back one word, good. But she could feel, in that single word, everything he had not been able to say when he arranged the marriage without telling her. She could feel the apology, and the love, and the specific relief of a man who had been afraid he had done the wrong thing, and was now, slowly, beginning to believe that perhaps he had not. She forgave him fully in that moment. She had mostly forgiven him already, but that letter completed it. She put it away. She picked up her gloves. She went back outside. There was more planting to do. The invitation to attend the London season arrived in May, and it arrived not as a social pleasure, but as a political requirement. Julian set it on the breakfast table with a brevity that told her more than the letter did. Parliament, he said. There are 3 readings I should be present for. I've avoided the last 2 sessions. Avoiding a third would be noticed in ways that could affect the estate's interests. Elara looked at the letter, then at him. When? Late May. Through June at minimum. She folded her hands around her tea. She did not say anything immediately, because she was thinking, and she had learned that Julian did not need her to fill the thinking space with words. What she was thinking was this. She knew what London was going to look like. She had been out of London society since the wedding, and the wedding had not been the kind of event that left people with warmth. She knew perfectly well that 6 months of absence had not quieted the whispers. In her experience, absence from society did not quiet whispers. It gave them more room to move. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She set down her cup. "But if you go without me, it creates a different kind of problem." He considered this. He was practical enough to understand she was right. A duke who appeared in London for the season, without his wife of 6 months, generated questions that were harder to manage than the questions a wife's presence generated. "The season will be," he started. "Difficult," she said. "I know. I was there for the beginning of it. I heard what people said." He looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been wanting to address something for a while, and finally decided to. "I should have done more about that," he said. "At the time, the things that were said." She shook her head. "You were not in a position to." "I could have." "Julian," she said it with the quiet authority she had earned through months of exactly this kind of steadiness. "You were not well. Managing society was not in the reasonable scope of what you could be expected to do. What matters now is what we do now." She paused. "And now, we go to London, and we present a marriage that is real, which it is, and we deal with whatever society decides to make of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it a real marriage?" The question landed between them with more weight than he had probably intended, or possibly exactly the weight he intended. She was not always certain where the line was with him. Still, she looked at him directly. "It is the realest thing I have been a part of," she said. "That is my honest answer." He held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded, once, and looked away. But the set of his shoulders was different after that, less braced. They went to London in the 3rd week of May. The house Julian kept in Grosvenor Square was larger than Ashmore Park in some ways, and smaller in the ones that mattered. It had no garden. It had the particular interior quality of a house that had been maintained by caretakers rather than lived in. Everything in its correct place, nothing out, nothing personal, nothing that gave away that a human being used the space rather than simply occupying it. Alara arrived, and within 2 days, had rearranged the sitting room. She did not make a project of it. She simply moved certain things to positions that made more sense, and put flowers in 2 vases, and placed her father's book on the side table, in the way you place things that you are actually reading, rather than displaying. She asked the cook to change the breakfast menu to the same simple arrangement they had at Ashmore, because routine was more important in a changed environment than in a familiar one, and Julian needed the routine to remain intact. He noticed the flowers. He said, looking at them, "You do that everywhere." "Do what?" "Make things inhabitable." He said it without inflection, but she had learned that his without inflection was not absence of meaning. It was meaning that he had not decided how to deliver yet. "Habitable," she corrected mildly. "That too," he said. The first social engagement was a dinner at the home of Lord and Lady Casterton, political, unavoidable, and attended by exactly the kind of people Alara had expected. She put on her best dress, which was blue and well-made, and did not apologize for itself, and she went. The evening began in the way she had anticipated. The specific quality of the attention, too much of it, the wrong kind, calibrated to assess rather than welcome, was familiar. She had grown up knowing that attention, the particular weight of a room that had decided something about you before you walked in, and was now checking whether its decision was correct. She moved through it with the same stillness she had always had, greeting people directly, making no attempt to soften herself into something more palatable, asking questions rather than volunteering information, because questions gave you more while giving away less. Lady Casterton, the hostess, was a large woman of tremendous social architecture, which meant she managed her rooms with the precision of a general managing a campaign. She was perfectly pleasant to Alara in the way that a very skilled hostess is pleasant to a guest she has not yet decided about. Alara was pleasant, back in exactly the same register, which she could see slightly unsettled the woman, who had perhaps expected something more deferential. It was during the pre-dinner gathering in the drawing room that she heard it. She was not supposed to hear it. The two women who said it were standing behind a tall flower arrangement near the window, and they had the confidence of people who believed their voices were private. One of them, a narrow woman in yellow whom Alara did not know by name, said, with the comfortable assurance of someone restating something they had said many times, "They say she simply does not know how to dress the position. You can see it, can't you? There's nothing there that says Duchess." The second woman, a little quieter, said, "Poor Julian. He really did give the city every reason to be confused by this match." Alara had continued moving. She had refilled her glass from a passing tray and turned to speak to a man nearby about a matter of parliamentary procedure she had been reading about, and she had done all of this with the same composed expression she had walked in with, because she had been handling things like this since she was old enough to understand what people were saying about her mother at church suppers. What she had not seen, while she handled it with the composure she had always had, was Julian. Julian had been on the other side of the flower arrangement. She did not know this until later. She found out when he crossed the room to her with a purpose in his step that she had not seen before in a social setting. Not controlled, not managed, but direct in the particular way of a man who has decided. He came to her side. He looked at her, briefly, and then he turned to the room. He said, to the woman in yellow, who had gone considerably more still, "Lady Prentice." His voice was entirely courteous and entirely clear. "I don't believe you've been properly introduced to my wife." Lady Prentice looked as if she had recently been asked to swallow something difficult. She said, with the brittle brightness of someone performing their way out of a situation, "Of course, how delightful." "Alara," Julian said, "is the most capable person I know. She also has excellent hearing." He said this last sentence with perfect pleasantness, and then he turned to Alara and offered her his hand. "Shall we go into dinner?" She took his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, as they moved away. "I should have been faster," he said, equally quietly. "You were exactly fast enough," she said. They went into dinner. At the table, Julian sat beside her, which was not the conventional arrangement for such dinners, and spoke to her across the courses with the ease of someone who was no longer performing for the room, but simply present with the person he was sitting next to. The room noticed. Rooms always notice. She could feel the attention shift, recalibrate, readjust, begin the work of revising conclusions that had been drawn too quickly. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt something quieter and more durable. She felt, for the first time since this marriage began, that she and Julian were on the same side of something. Not arranged on opposite sides of a social performance, not managing separate sets of expectations, but actually, genuinely, on the same side. It was the feeling she had been working toward without quite naming it, and it was better than she had expected. After dinner, when the guests had separated for the customary period and then recombined, she found herself near the fireplace, speaking with a woman she did not know, named Caroline, who was younger than the others and who had the expression of someone attending these gatherings under duress. They talked about books for 20 minutes, and it was, quietly, the best 20 minutes of the evening. Later, in the carriage back to Grosvenor Square, Julian sat beside her instead of across from her, a small, deliberate alteration. "How are you?" he asked. "Quite well," she said, and then, more honestly, tired, but well. "You were remarkable," he said. "You are always remarkable, but tonight particularly." She looked at him. He was looking at the city passing the carriage window, and his face was not guarded. It was open, in the specific way of someone who has said something true and is not retreating from it. "So were you," she said. He did not answer, but she felt the pressure of his shoulder against hers, which in the context of what they were and what they had survived, was its own complete answer. The city slid past the window, gaslit and loud, and entirely indifferent to the small, enormous thing that had just happened between these two people in a carriage moving through it. She was, she realized, not afraid of London anymore. She was not sure exactly when that had changed. She thought perhaps it had changed in the moment he crossed the room. She thought perhaps it had been changing for a long time before that, and the crossing of the room was simply the moment it became visible. She leaned her head very slightly, just slightly, to the left, and felt the steadiness of him beside her, and did not ask for anything more than that. It was enough. For tonight, it was entirely enough. The weeks in London were long and socially demanding, in the way that London was always demanding. Relentlessly public, carefully stratified, conducted at a pace that left very little room for anything private. Alara managed it the way she managed most things, methodically, without pretense, by being exactly who she was, rather than performing a version of who she thought was required. This turned out, in London's case, to be something of a surprise. Society had built a picture of Alara Voss in her absence. It was not a flattering picture. It had been assembled from the materials available: the modest family background, the absent mother, the quiet wedding, the extended retreat to Wiltshire, and it had produced a version of her that was small and uncertain and slightly apologetic, the kind of woman who had arrived at a position far above her, and knew it, and was grateful to anyone who let her pretend otherwise. The woman who appeared at Lady Casterton's dinner, and then the Pemberton musical evening, and then the garden party at Lord Fallow's house on the edge of the park, was not that woman. She was quiet, yes. She was direct in a way that disconcerted people who expected either deference or aggression, and had not prepared for simple, honest engagement. She was clearly extremely well read, which several of the gentlemen she spoke to found interesting, and several of the ladies found perplexing in a way they could not quite articulate. And she was, unmistakably, at ease. Not performance ease. Real ease. The ease of someone who had spent the past several months dealing with things that were genuinely difficult and had come through with their character intact, so that a London garden party, however intimidating its architecture of status, was simply not the most demanding environment she had recently navigated. The recalibration of opinion was visible, if you were watching for it. Alara was always watching for it, not out of vanity, but because social dynamics were information, and she treated information seriously. She watched people move from their first assessments toward second ones. She watched the women who had expected to pity her find instead that there was nothing to pity, and have to reorganize their feelings around that discovery. She watched the men who had expected to overlook her be startled by something she said, and then pretend they had not been startled, which was the most London response possible. Julian watched all of this too. She was aware of him watching. He was a different social creature than her, more overtly powerful in rooms, more immediately commanding of attention by virtue of his title and bearing. But she had noticed, over the course of the London weeks, that he had begun to use his position differently. Where before he had been present at these events in the cold, self-contained way of someone fulfilling a duty they found meaningless, he was now present in a way that was engaged, and occasionally even, she thought, enjoying itself. He talked to people. Not performed conversation, actual conversation, in which he asked things and listened to the answers, and followed one thread to another. She had seen what he was like when he was actually engaged with a subject, the quality of his attention, and the sharpness of his mind, and here in London, it was beginning to show in ways it had not shown in years. One evening, at a gathering that ran later than most into the night, she found him in a corner of the host's library with 3 men she did not know, talking about agricultural reform, with the intensity and knowledge of someone who had been thinking carefully about the subject for years, which she knew, from the estate records she had been learning, that he had. He had extensive notes on it. He had simply not been discussing them with anyone. He saw her looking. He did not break off the conversation. She would not have wanted him to. But he made a small gesture toward the chair near him, and she came and sat there, and the conversation continued, and included her when it naturally should, which was several times. After, walking home through the summer night, because the weather was fine enough to warrant it, he said, "You like the political conversations." "I do," she said. "I've been reading your estate notes." He looked at her. "Have you?" "Since February," she said. "I hope that was all right. They were in the library." A pause. Then he said, "Did you have thoughts about them?" "Several," she said. "Some of which I'd like to discuss, if you're willing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tomorrow morning, after breakfast." "After breakfast," she agreed. They walked through the London night with the sounds of the city around them. Carriages, voices, music leaking from a lit window somewhere. And she thought about how different this was from the carriage ride they had taken from the church 8 months ago. The same city, the same 2 people. Everything else entirely changed. She thought about the particular thing he had done at Lady Casterton's dinner. crossing the room, saying her name as if it were something worth saying clearly. She thought about the way he had described the marriage when she had asked. Not as an arrangement, not in the managed language he still used sometimes for difficult things, but as real. He had used the word real. She had not asked him to elaborate. She had not pressed it, or turned it into a declaration, or made it mean more than it was ready to mean. She had simply received it, and put it carefully somewhere. There was time. She had always understood there was time. She was not in a hurry. They reached Grosvenor Square. The house was lit. The night was warm. Julian held the door open for her, and she went inside, and he followed, and the door closed behind them on the London summer night. It was a small thing. It was the smallest possible thing. But she had always known that small things were where everything began. They returned to Ashmore Park in late June, and the garden received them. That was the only word for it. The lavender was fully established, not yet at the height of its flowering, but well on its way, and the rose arch had come into bloom with a density that Alara had hoped for, but not quite believed in until she saw it. The apple trees, with their first proper pruning in years, had responded with something that looked almost like gratitude. New growth, in the right places, the structure clarifying. The south bed was not finished, would not be finished for years, because that was how gardens worked. But it was alive, in a way it had not been when she arrived. Julian stood at the edge of it for a long time on the afternoon they came back. Then he said, "I'd like to help." She looked at him. He was looking at the rose arch, at the place where his mother had stood when she planted it, which was not a place he had been able to look directly for a long time. "I'd welcome that," she said. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, "with plants. I haven't done it since I was a child." "You don't need to know," she said. "You just need to be willing to learn, and to not be in a hurry." He turned to look at her then. "Those are the same instructions you gave me at the beginning," he said, "about everything else." "They work for most things," she said. Something in his expression shifted, that almost warmth she had seen before, but larger now, less tentative. Less like the beginning of something, and more like the thing itself. "Yes," he said. "I've found that to be true." They began working in the garden together. It was a different kind of time from anything they had shared before. The London weeks had been social, managed, conducted in the presence of other people and the requirements of other people. The months before that had been the months of the darkest things, the work of pulling back from the edge, the difficult business of building something habitable from something that had fallen apart. This was neither of those things. This was ordinary. It was the ordinary pleasure of two people working alongside each other in a place they both cared about, learning each other in the way you learn someone when you do not have to be performing anything at all. He was systematic when she showed him something. Once she demonstrated a technique, he applied it carefully and did not need to be told twice. He had a good eye for balance, for what was overcrowded and what needed more room, which she suspected came from years of looking at estate management in a different but related way. He worked without talking much, which suited her, and when he did speak, it was to ask a precise question about what he was doing, or to make an observation about the plant that was often more accurate than she expected. He also, she noticed, began to move differently in the house. It was difficult to describe this precisely, which was why she had not tried. But there was a quality of presence in a person that you can feel, a sense of whether someone is actually occupying the space they are in, or merely passing through it while located somewhere else in their head. Julian had been, for most of the time she had known him, largely elsewhere, present in body, absent in everything that mattered. She had watched him come back, degree by degree, over the months. But it was in the summer, at Ashmore Park, with the lavender in the ground, and the roses on the arch, and the two of them working in the same direction, that she felt the shift become something she could reliably name. He was here. Not perfectly, not without the bad days that still came, and that she did not expect to stop entirely, because she was realistic about the nature of what they were dealing with, but here in the way that matters, genuinely present, genuinely engaged, making choices rather than managing a retreat. The conversation about Edmund's rooms came on a Wednesday evening in July, when it was warm enough to sit outside after dinner, and the light lasted long enough to make it worthwhile. They were sitting on the stone bench near the south bed, with tea going cold in their cups, and Julian said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about his rooms." She waited. "I don't want to keep them as they are," he said, "but I don't want to empty them either. The way you empty a place you're done with. He paused. Edmund would not have wanted to be a room that no one went into. No, she said. He sounds like someone who would have found that rather undignified. He would have been furious, Julian said. And there was, in his voice, the beginning of what she recognized from the night on the East Wing floor. The genuine texture of a man, remembering someone he loved, without the punishment layer on top of it. He would have said something extremely rude about sentimental excess, and then pointed out that the room had very good light, and ought to be used for something. What would he have liked it used for? She asked. Julian thought about this seriously. She could see him actually thinking about it, not managing the question, not deflecting it, but considering Edmund's particular preferences with the fond attention of someone who actually remembered what those preferences were. He liked to read, he said after a moment. Not academic things, stories. He had a passion for travel writing. Accounts of people going to places he intended to go and never quite did. A pause. He played cards. Not very well. He would have liked a card table. Another pause. And then, more quietly, he liked the north light. He always said it was better for reading. Alara looked toward the East Wing. Then perhaps that's what it becomes, she said. A reading room, with a card table, and the north windows. Julian was quiet for a long moment. He would approve of you, he said then. It came out straightforwardly, without apparent calculation, which told her he had been thinking about it for a while and had simply not found a natural moment until now. He would have approved of you from the first conversation. He was a much better judge of people than I am. She looked at him. You're a reasonably good judge, she said. You simply need more time to arrive at the verdict. The corners of his mouth moved. The full expression came now, where before there had only been the shadow of it. An extremely charitable characterization, he said. I am extremely charitable, she agreed. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. You are not charitable. You are honest. There's a significant difference. He paused. Charitable suggests generosity about flaws. Honest suggests you see the actual thing accurately. He looked at the garden. You are, I think, the most accurate person I have ever met. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, Will you go into Edmund's room to talk about what to do with it? He turned his teacup in his hands. Yes, he said. I think I will. When you're ready, she said. I think I'm ready now, he said, which surprised her. But the surprise was a good one. They went upstairs together, through the East Wing hallway, and Julian opened the door himself and walked in without hesitation, in the way of someone who has rehearsed the walk many times in their head and is now simply doing it. The room was as it had been on the night they sat on the floor together, preserved, not empty, full in its specific way. Julian walked through it slowly. He touched things, briefly, as you touch things when you are saying something to them that does not require words. He went to the window and stood in the north light. Alara watched from the doorway and did not come in unless invited. He stood there for a few minutes. Then he said, without turning, The card table should go here, near the window. He looked at the bookshelves. The travel books can stay. The rest, he paused. I'd like to choose what stays and what goes, carefully. Of course, she said. I'd like you to help me. She stepped into the room. Tell me about each thing, she said. We'll decide together. They were in there for 2 hours. He talked about each object with the care of someone returning to a language he had not spoken in years, but had never forgotten. Some things he decided immediately. The coat hook could stay. The specific arrangement of books he knew Edmund had cared about. Other things he sat with for a while, turning them over in his hands, not deciding until he was sure. She did not hurry any of it. She sat on the floor again, because it was comfortable, and there was still no chair, and she listened, and occasionally offered a thought when one was wanted. By the end, the room had a different quality. Nothing major had changed, but it had been thought about, deliberately, by someone who loved the person it had belonged to, and that deliberateness was what the room had needed. The grief that had pooled in it for 6 years had been touched, directly and with intention, and something about that changed its nature. Julian closed the door behind them when they left. Not locked, just closed, the way you close a door to a room you intend to use again. In the corridor he said, Thank you. Again, for not leaving, when I made it very difficult to stay. You were worth staying for, she said. He looked at her. Something was on his face that she had been watching build for months, that had been present in pieces, and was now, for the first time, present whole. She met his gaze and held it. He said, I know it was not what you expected. I didn't come with expectations, she said. I came with a notebook and sensible boots. A breath of real laughter. Not performed, not managed. The actual thing. She had heard it before, in brief moments, but this was fuller. This was how he actually laughed when nothing was stopping it. And it was a good sound, low and genuine, and entirely unself-conscious. Ilara, he said. Yes. I am going to try to be worthy of this. She looked at him steadily. You already are, she said. You have been, for some time. You simply didn't know it yet. He held her gaze for a long, still moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, carefully, as he did everything now, with deliberate attention, and held it. Not dramatically, just held it. Outside the east wing window, the summer evening was gold and long and unhurried, and the garden below was full of lavender, and the roses on the arch were open. Inside, the door to Edmund's room was closed and unlocked. And in the east wing corridor, two people stood with their hands joined, not saying anything, which was exactly the right thing. August brought the estate's tenants, which was not unusual in itself. The tenants had always been there. But it brought them to Julian in a new way, because Julian had begun going to them. This had started quietly, in June, when he had ridden out to the eastern boundary farms to look at a drainage problem that had been reported to Cobb. He went initially because it was practical, but he had stayed longer than the drainage problem required, which told Ilara, when Cobb mentioned it in passing, that something else had happened during the visit. What had happened, she gathered gradually, was that Julian had found himself talking to people who knew the land and knew him, and had missed him in the particular way that people miss someone who was useful and present and then wasn't. Not resentfully. That was the important thing. The tenants of Ashmore had not become resentful of their absent duke in the way that tenants of other absent estates might have, because Mrs. Partridge and Cobby had managed things competently, and because the duke's previous reputation, before the grief took hold, had been a good one. So when he returned, the reception was warm. And warmth, she was learning, was something Julian Cavendish had been without for long enough that it reached him differently than coldness did. Coldness he could manage. It was the warmth that got past his defenses. He came back from the tenant visits changed in ways that were small and cumulative. He came back with information, real, specific information about the land and the people who worked it, and he began doing things with that information. He wrote letters. He made decisions about improvements that had been needed for years and that he had been too absent to implement. He wrote out again, and again. By August, it was regular. She watched this with the same quiet attention she gave everything. She did not comment on it, or draw attention to it, because she understood instinctively that pointing at things that were working sometimes caused people to become self-conscious about them, and then they stopped working. But she was glad, enormously glad, not because of what it meant for the estate, though it meant a great deal for the estate, because of what it meant for Julian, that he had found his way back to something purposeful, something real, something that connected him to the world, in the most direct possible way. One evening in August, sitting in the garden after dinner in the long summer light, he said, "The Halley family farm is struggling." She looked at him. "I thought the Halleys had a prosperous farm." They did. Old William Halley was an excellent farmer. His son Henry is... He stopped, choosing words. Henry is not his father. He means well, and he works hard, but he makes decisions from anxiety rather than knowledge, and anxious decisions in farming are expensive. He looked at the lavender. "I spent an afternoon there yesterday. I looked at the accounts he would show me, and at the fields, and I think I can help. There are things I know about the South Fields specifically, how they drain, what they grow best. My father worked closely with William, and I was there a great deal as a boy." He paused. "I remember things." "Of course you do," she said. He looked at her. "I had forgotten," he said, "that I remembered things. There was a long time when I couldn't, when trying to remember anything from before was too much. Everything from before was contaminated by what came after." He paused. "I can remember now. The good things come back cleanly." She nodded. This was something she knew from her own experience. That grief, when it begins to lift, does not take the memories with it. It leaves them, and the memories, freed from the weight of the grief, can simply be what they were. Moments of a life that contained joy before the pain arrived. "Tell me about helping Henry Halley," she said, because she wanted to hear him talk about it, not because she needed the information. He talked for an hour. He talked about farming with the depth of someone who had absorbed an enormous amount of it in childhood, from a father who loved the land and shared that love actively with both his sons. He talked about drainage and crop rotation, and the specific qualities of the Ashmore soil in its different fields. He talked about conversations with old William Halley that he had half forgotten and were now returning, the kind of absorbed knowledge that sits in a person below the level of conscious memory and comes back when there is a reason to retrieve it. She listened to all of it, and she thought, this is who he was. This is the person who was here before the grief, not returned entirely. He was not the same person. No one is the same person after what he had been through, but accessed again, in a new form that carried what he had survived and was not destroyed by it. The next morning she wrote to her father with more than she usually shared. She told him that the estate was doing well. She told him that the garden was extraordinary this summer, and that she wished he could see the roses. She told him that Julian had been riding out to the tenants and was making changes to the farming practices on the south fields, and that his knowledge of the land was deep and careful, and the tenants trusted him in a way that was evident from how they spoke to him. She told him, at the end, that she thought the marriage was a real one. Her father wrote back, "I am glad. I knew it might be. I hoped." She folded the letter and placed it with the others she kept. The drawer was fuller than it had been. It contained her mother's journal, her father's letters, Catherine Cavendish's journal that she had taken from the fireplace grate, and which she intended to return to Julian at the right moment, and a handful of her own notes from the first months. She was building something. She had always understood that, but she had not known, at the beginning, quite what the shape of it would be. She knew better now. It was the shape of two lives that had each been in trouble and had found each other, and had, with a great deal of patience and a great deal of honesty, and the particular kind of care that does not require dramatic gestures, made something together that neither of them could have made alone. She closed the drawer. She went downstairs where Julian was waiting to discuss the South Fields drainage problem over tea, and she sat down across from him and gave him her full attention. And outside the window the summer was so bright and so full that the garden seemed to be trying to outdo itself, which was exactly what it was doing. The newspaper column appeared in early autumn, and it was not kind. Not unkind either, in the way that columns about people rarely are when they are trying to appear balanced. It was the worst kind, the kind that was technically complimentary, while being fundamentally condescending. It appeared in a social column that Alara did not usually read, but which Dot, who read everything, left on the breakfast table, with the expression of someone who was uncertain whether to apologize. Alara read it over her tea. The column was about the remarkable recovery of the Duke of Ashmore. Those were the actual words used. Remarkable recovery. As if Julian were a horse that had been thought lame, and had surprised everyone by walking correctly. It described him as having returned to his parliamentary duties with renewed focus, having been seen at a number of social gatherings, with what the columnist archly called his customary precision of manner restored. It noted, with the specific quality of faint praise, that the Duke's estate was reported to be under more active management than it had been in some years. Not one word of it mentioned Alara. She finished her tea. She refolded the paper. She thought, of course. This was the thing that London did. It saw the surface and attributed it to the most convenient source. Julian was a duke, and therefore the narrative of his return to form was his alone. The mechanism by which that return had happened was invisible, because the mechanism was a woman, and women in the narrative of recovery were either decorative or absent. She was not surprised. She was not precisely hurt. She was, and she sat with this, honestly to understand what she actually was, quietly angry, in the specific way of someone who has worked very hard on something real and watched the world fail to notice. Not because she needed the credit. She genuinely did not need the credit, and she had never done any of it for recognition. But because the invisibility of what she had done was not just about her. It was about the category. It was the world saying, again and in a clear voice, that what women do in the private hours, The work that is hardest and least visible, and most essential, does not count as work. She put the paper in the kitchen. Then she went and found Julian, who was in the library reading a letter from his parliamentary committee, and she sat down and told him about the column directly, because she was not going to carry that around without saying something. He listened. When she finished, he set down the letter, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's infuriating." "Yes," she said. "What would you like me to do?" She considered. "Nothing to the newspaper," she said. "That would make it worse, and would look like I needed it, which I don't." She paused. "But I would like you to know what it felt like to read it." "I know," he said, and then, "No, I know I don't know fully. Tell me what it felt like." She looked at him. This was something he had been doing more often, not accepting the easy surface version of things, but asking for the actual one. It was the thing she found most remarkable about the change in him, not the social participation or the estate engagement, but this, the willingness to actually listen to what was real. "It felt like being erased," she said, very politely, very publicly, with good intentions and complete unawareness. She paused, which is the kind of erasure that is hardest to respond to, because there is no malice to address. He nodded slowly. The people who did it wouldn't understand what they'd done wrong. "No," she said. "They would think they were being complimentary about you," which they were. He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to write something," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "A letter, to the Parliamentary Gazette, not responding to the column. You're right, that would make it worse. But I've been asked to contribute a piece about agricultural reform, on the Wiltshire estates. I was going to decline, but I won't." He paused. "And in it, I am going to say very specifically that the renewed focus of the past year is owed in considerable part to the perspective and practical knowledge of the Duchess of Ashmore, who has applied herself to matters of estate and land with a seriousness and expertise that has been of genuine value." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." He looked at her directly. "I have spent a great deal of time, over the past year, receiving things from you. I would like to give something back that is actually accurate, rather than merely appropriate." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something was moving through her that was not quite emotion, but was the thing underneath emotion, the deep, settled recognition of being genuinely seen. She had been coping with not being seen for a very long time, and she was good at it, and she had not quite understood how much it cost until just now, when the cost was being lifted. "The letter would be very welcome," she said. "Good," he said. He picked up his pen. She watched him begin it, the careful, deliberate way he formed the opening sentence, which told her he was writing with intention, and not just with words. And she thought about the question people would ask, if they were watching this moment, which was, "How did you do it? How do you fix a man who has been that broken?" And she would have told them, if asked, that the question was already wrong, because she had not fixed anything, and she had not done it to him. She had simply remained. She had provided structure, and refused to flinch, and told the truth consistently, and treated him as a person who was capable of healing, rather than as a problem to be solved. She had, when it was needed, spoken directly about the hardest things. She had, when it was not needed, planted lavender. The fixing was his, every step of it. She had made the conditions. He had done the walking. She picked up her own notebook and sat in the chair by the window and began writing a letter to the Kent nursery about a new variety she wanted to try next spring. And the library was quiet around them, in the particular warm way of rooms where two people are doing separate things, in genuine comfort with each other. This, too, was what it looked like. Not the things the newspaper columns captured. This. Two people in a library on an autumn morning, each working at their own work, the door closed against the world, entirely at ease. That evening, as the light came off the south lawns in long October bars, a woman named Cecily Ormond, who had written, nearly a year ago, the fastest and cruelest letter about the new Duchess of Ashmore, sat in her London drawing room and read an account of the Ashmore autumn entertainments that had begun, quietly, to appear in the social pages. The account described a dinner at which the Duke and Duchess had hosted a gathering of landowners and their wives, at which the conversation had reportedly been the best of the autumn season, and the Duchess had been described, by more than one attendee, as someone who spoke with great knowledge about land management and natural science, and who had a way of engaging with everyone in the room that made people feel they had been genuinely heard. Cecily Ormond read this with the expression of a woman who has been very wrong about something and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. She decided not to acknowledge it aloud, but something in her face changed as she read, and she put the paper down more carefully than she had picked it up. And she did not, that evening or afterward, add anything further to the conversation about the Duchess of Ashmore. Quietly, invisibly, the social arithmetic was adjusting. The verdict was not the verdict that had been expected. It was something else entirely. Something that people like Cecily Ormond and Lady Prentice and the woman who had written the column without mentioning Alara would have to live with, without quite knowing how to name what had gone wrong in their predictions. What had gone wrong was simple. They had miscounted. They had looked at Alara Voss and seen a deficit. They had looked at what she was not grand, not connected, not ornamented in the right ways, and concluded she was nothing. They had not seen the surplus. The years of reading, the years of managing and observing and learning, quietly, in the rooms of a difficult life. The specific, earned capability of a woman who had grown up in the shadow of something hard and had come out of it not diminished, but educated, in ways that could not be purchased or inherited or performed. They had miscounted. Alara, sitting at her writing desk that evening, as the autumn closed around Ashmore Park and the lavender darkened to its winter gray, did not know about Cecily Ormond's quiet revision. She did not need to know about it. She was writing to her father, who had sent a brief and somewhat breathless letter saying that his doctor had found, at his last examination, that his heart appeared stronger than it had in 2 years, and that this was unexpected and rather wonderful. She read that letter 3 times. She felt something open in her chest that had been held tight since the morning she had understood he was ill. She wrote back, "This is the best news I have ever received. I intend to believe it absolutely." She sealed the letter. She set it out for the Morning Post. Then she put on her coat and went out into the October garden, into the cold and the dark and the smell of the earth preparing itself for winter. And she stood in the middle of the lavender border, which was gray and bare now but entirely present, entirely itself, alive under the surface in all the ways that mattered. She stood there for a few minutes. Then she went inside. There was a great deal to do tomorrow. There was always a great deal to do tomorrow, and she was deeply, quietly grateful for that. November came, and with it the particular quality of Wiltshire winter that was not dramatic, but was very thorough. The garden had gone to ground in the efficient way of gardens that know what they are doing. Everything pulled back into itself, the energy redistributed to the roots. All the visible growth paused, but nothing, underneath, stopped. Alara had a great affection for this phase of a garden. People who did not know gardens found it dispiriting. All that gray and brown, all that apparent stillness. People who did know them understood that this was one of the most important phases, the one in which everything consolidated and prepared and built the strength for what came next. She thought about this while she walked the south path on a gray November morning, and she thought, this is what the past year has been, more or less. The long consolidation, the preparation, the building that happens below the visible surface. What was coming next was not clear yet. But she had stopped needing to know what came next before she could commit to the present, and she thought that was probably one of the more important things she had learned. Julian found her at the end of the south path, standing at the rose arch. The roses were bare now, the canes stripped of everything but the structure. But the structure was good. The rootstock was excellent. She had known from February that it could be brought back. He stood beside her and looked at it. "Next summer," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked at it for a moment longer. "My mother would have liked what you've done with it." What was she like? Alara asked. She had never asked directly. She had gathered pieces, from the journal, from Mrs. Partridge, from what Julian had shared in the context of other conversations, but she had not asked directly. He thought about it in the serious way he thought about all things now. She was impatient, he said, in a good way. She did not tolerate waste of time, waste of potential, waste of feeling. She thought that doing things halfway was more disrespectful to the thing than not doing them at all. He paused. She would have had very little patience for what I was doing with my life for the past 6 years. But she would have understood it, Elara said. Yes, he said. She understood things before she judged them. That was the sequence. First understand, then judge. A pause. She wrote about it, in a journal she kept. Elara was very still. I know you found it, he said quietly. Mrs. Partridge told me. She said you'd put it away carefully, without reading it to anyone, or speaking of it. It wasn't mine to speak of, Elara said. He nodded. I'd like you to keep it, he said, the journal. Or, I'd like you to have read it, which you have. I'd like that not to be a secret between us. She turned to look at him. I did read part of it, she said, not all of it. The last entry. He looked at the rose arch. He knew what the last entry said. She could see that he knew. She was exhausted, he said. She had been trying for years, and she was exhausted. And she wrote what she wrote, because she was honest in her journal, in a way she couldn't be to anyone else. He paused. She died the following spring. Not from the exhaustion, from a fever that came on suddenly. But I've wondered, sometimes, whether the exhaustion had something to do with how quickly it took her. Elara said, the exhaustion was real, and also she was wrong. He looked at her. She wrote that you couldn't be reached, Elara said. She was wrong. Something moved through his face. Not argument. He was not going to argue with her. He simply looked at her steadily, and what was in his expression was complex, in the way that things are complex when they are true, and do not simplify. She did not have the right conditions, Elara said. That is not a comment on her love or her effort. It is simply a fact. The conditions were not right. She was too close, and too frightened, and too alone in the trying, and she wore out. She paused. The conditions matter. The conditions are not nothing. He was quiet for a long moment. And the conditions were right, he said slowly. With you. Different, she said. Not right, exactly. Just different. I came without fear. I came with knowledge. I came having already lived with something like it, which meant I was not discovering it for the first time. She paused. Your mother was discovering you as her son, while also discovering what was happening to you. That is two things at once. Too much. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. Watched him take the thing his mother had written, and place it differently, in a new context, without abandoning the grief of it, but without the addition of the guilt that had been running alongside it. You've been thinking about this for a long time, he said. Since I read the journal, she said. In February. February, he said. It was not quite a question. It was more like someone realizing how long another person has been carrying something quietly, and finding the duration significant. It helped me understand, she said simply. He looked at her. The November morning was very still around them, the whole of the south garden bare and gray and waiting, and he looked at her with an expression that was not the one she had been building toward, but was rather the fully formed version of all the expressions she had been watching develop, all of them composed now into something single and clear. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask, she said. Are you happy here? The question landed with more weight than its small size suggested, because it was not a social question. It was a real question, asked by someone who genuinely did not know the answer and genuinely wanted to. It was the question of a person who understood, perhaps for the first time in the context of this marriage, that her happiness was something separate from his situation, something that mattered independently, that deserved to be asked about directly. She thought about her answer. She always thought about her answers. I am content, she said, which is better than happy, in my experience. Happy is a weather condition. It comes and goes. Content is more like soil quality. It's what's underneath everything else. He looked at her. And the soil quality is good? The soil quality, she said, is very good. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. The same careful, deliberate gesture from the East Wing corridor in the summer. She took his hand back, with the same quality of intention. They stood at the rose arch in the November cold, and the estate was quiet around them, and everything was bare and everything was exactly as it should be. And far below the gray surface of the garden, the roots of the lavender and the roses were deep in the dark earth, doing what roots do, which is the most essential work of all. She looked at the arch. He looked at the arch. Next summer, she said again. Yes, he said. They stood there a while longer, and then they went inside together. And Mrs. Partridge had left tea on the table in the library, and they sat on either side of the fire, and the afternoon closed in around them, gray and warm and entirely sufficient. Winter came, and the letter from her father came with it, and the letter was not the one she had been afraid of. It was the letter she had hoped for, and it was so different from what she had braced herself for that she had to read it 3 times before she let herself believe it. He had seen the doctor. The doctor had run his tests and spoken with a colleague in London who was considered very good at these particular matters of the heart, and the colleague had agreed. The strengthening was real and sustained. It was not guaranteed, the doctor said. Nothing about hearts could be guaranteed. But it was genuine, and it was continuing, and it was the opposite of what had been predicted a year ago. George Voss wrote the whole account in his careful handwriting, with the particular quality of someone who is very glad and is not quite sure he has permission to be. And at the end he said, "I think I may have more time than I expected. I intend to use it well." Alara sat with this letter for a long time. She sat with it in the library at Ashmore Park, in the chair by the window where she always sat, and she let herself feel what she felt, which was something that had been building for a long time. Not tears exactly, but the feeling underneath tears, the feeling of the thing held very tight for a very long time, beginning, slowly, to be released. Julian found her there. He came in with a book he intended to read, and he stopped when he saw her face, and he understood immediately, with the perceptiveness he had developed over the past year, that something had happened. She told him. She showed him the letter, which was the first time she had shown him a letter from her father, and which she did not think about analytically, but simply did, because it was what she wanted to do. He read it carefully. Then he set it on the table between them. "That's good news," he said. "Not a performance of warmth, real warmth, the straightforward kind. That is very good news." "Yes," she said. "You've been worrying about this since before we married," he said. "Before that," she said, "since I worked out he was ill." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know you were carrying that." "You had your own things to carry," she said. He shook his head. "That is not an excuse for not asking." He looked at her steadily. "I should have asked. I should have asked much earlier what you were carrying." He paused. "What else are you carrying that I haven't asked about?" The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected. It was the kind of question he asked now, the reaching in kind, the real kind, but because it surprised her to find that she had not been asked it before by anyone who genuinely wanted the answer. She thought about it honestly. "The question of what comes next," she said. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She stopped, finding words. "I came here with a purpose, a specific, urgent purpose, which was to see if I could help. And I did help, and things are different now, which I am very glad of." She paused. "But I am not sure, quite, what I am now, what I'm for, in the season after the urgent thing." He looked at her for a long time. "The same thing you've always been," he said, "except now with more." "More what?" "More of what you already have, but with someone who is actually here." He paused. "I was not, for most of this year, actually here, not in the way that would have been useful to you. I was receiving, very gratefully, but not present enough to give back." He looked at his hands. "I would like to try to be present enough to give back." She looked at him. "You've been doing that," she said, "for months." "Not enough," he said. "Not in the specific way you need it." He paused, and she could see him choosing words with care, which was something he did when he was saying something he had thought about in private, and was now bringing into the open. You need someone to ask how you are, and actually want to know. You need someone who is interested in what you think, not just in the fact that you can manage things. You need, he stopped briefly, you need to be the person who is tended to sometimes, not only the one tending. The accuracy of this landed somewhere deep in her. She had not named it to herself in quite those terms, but hearing it named she recognized it immediately as true. "Yes," she said, "that is what I need." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you long enough to know that." He held her gaze. "I intend to be better at it. I'm telling you so that you can hold me to it." "I will," she said. "Good," he said. They sat in the library for a while after that, and he did not read his book, and she did not go back to her work, and they simply talked. about her father, about what he had been like before the illness, the particular vivid person of him, his work, his way of explaining things, the two books that were excellent and largely unknown, about what she had learned from him, about the garden as inherited from a family that thought carefully about growing things. Julian listened to all of it, with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his version of fullness, engaged, present, following each thread she offered. He asked about her father's second book, the one that was on the Ashmore library shelf, and she told him her father would be amazed to know it was there, and Julian said he would like to meet her father, which was the first time he had said so directly. Next spring, she said, when the garden is coming back. He would like to see the lavender. Then bring him, Julian said, in spring, when the garden is right. She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, simply, without fuss, as a plan between equals who were making plans together, that told her more than larger declarations would have. This was how he said true things, plainly, directly, without theatrics. I will, she said. Outside, December was moving toward them across the Wiltshire hills, and the sky was the particular white of winter, about to begin its serious business. Inside the library, the fire was good, and the tea was warm, and the afternoon had the quality of something that was simply enough. She thought about the question he had asked her back in November, "Are you happy here?" and the answer she had given about contentment and soil quality. She thought the answer had been accurate but incomplete. She thought, I am also, increasingly, at home here. Not in the formal sense. That had been arranged by a solicitor on a particular morning, in a narrow office near Lincoln's Inn, and she had not had any feelings about it at the time. In the specific, earned sense. The way a place becomes home, not when you arrive, but when you have learned all its particular silences, and its qualities of light at different times of day, and its ways of responding to weather, and when the house knows you in return. Ashmore Park knew her now. She could feel it. Houses do know people, in their way. They hold the shape of the lives lived inside them. She had left marks here that were not visible exactly, but were present. The garden, the reorganized kitchen accounts, the rearranged south sitting room. The two lamps that were now always left burning, later on the ground floor, because she had noticed, early on, that Julian did better in lit rooms. Small things, the right things. She was a part of this place now, not the decorative part, the load-bearing part. She picked up her tea. Julian had opened his book, not because he was withdrawing, but because they had reached the end of the conversation, and were now simply sharing the room comfortably, which was its own form of intimacy. She watched the fire for a while. Then she picked up her own book, and they read. In the corridor outside, Mrs. Partridge passed with the linen count, and she paused for a moment outside the library door, which was slightly open, and she looked in and saw the two of them in their chairs on either side of the fire, each reading, the room warm and quiet, and inhabited in the way she had not seen it inhabited in a very long time. She stood there for a moment. Then she went on down the corridor, and her face had an expression that had not been there when the new Duchess arrived 11 months ago, an expression of settled, private gladness, the kind that has no need to announce itself. She had hoped, when Hartwell's letter came, that it would be someone good. It was someone better than good. It was someone exactly right. December carried its own kind of work. Alara had learned that estate households ran differently in winter. Less visible work, but no less of it, with the rhythms shifting to indoor tasks and the particular demands of keeping a large house habitable through cold months. She threw herself into it, not because it was required of her, but because she found she genuinely cared about the household and the people in it in a way that had crept up on her without announcement. She cared about Dot, who had spent the year adapting from the small Aldgate Street house to an estate, and had done it with a competence that deserved to be seen. She cared about Mrs. Partridge, who carried the household on her back with a quiet capability that was the kind of work society rewarded least and needed most. She cared about Cobb, who managed the estate's external needs with the solid reliability of someone who had been doing it long enough to have stopped needing acknowledgement. She cared about Graves and his son in the garden, who showed up every morning in every weather and treated the plants with the same careful respect she asked of them. She began doing something that winter that she had not planned to do. She wrote down what she knew, not formally, not a book, not something for publication, but a record, practical and detailed, of the methods she had used, The observations about routine and structure, the notes about what had worked and what had not, the specific, hard-won understanding of how to support someone who was suffering in the specific ways Julian had been suffering. She wrote it in the careful, clear way her father had taught her to write field notes, not with conclusions up front, but with observations first, and then the pattern that emerged from the observations, and then, very carefully, the principle that seemed to be operating underneath the pattern. She did not know what she would do with it. She told herself it was simply useful to record, in the way that any careful observation is useful to record, because you do not always know in advance what use a thing will be. But she suspected, in a quieter part of herself, that it was the beginning of something. She was not sure what yet. Julian, who had begun asking about her work more specifically, found her writing one evening and asked what she was doing. She told him. He read the first 2 pages, without asking for them. She offered them, and when he looked up, his expression had the particular quality of someone encountering something that is simultaneously new and makes complete sense. "This is what you did," he said. "It's an attempt to make it legible," she said. "Whether I've managed it, I'm not certain." "It's legible," he said. He set the pages down carefully. "There are other people who need this." She looked at him. "I know. What will you do with it?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I thought I'd finish writing it first, and then think about what it's for." He nodded. "That's the right order." "You've become rather methodical," she said. "I learned it from someone," he said. She smiled at that. Really smiled, without thinking about it, the involuntary kind. He saw it, and his own expression changed in response, with the same quality of involuntariness, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the writing desk in the December library, with the fire going, and the winter outside, and all of the year between them. It was the kind of moment that could not have existed a year ago, not because the materials were not there. The materials had always been there. But because a year ago, neither of them had yet done the particular work that made this kind of moment possible. He had done his work. She had done hers. And here they were. She picked up her pen and went back to writing. He sat down across from her and opened his parliamentary papers. The fire crackled. The wind moved over the house. In the garden, invisible under the winter dark, the roots of everything she had planted were settled deep in the earth, and entirely fine, and not worried about anything, because roots know that the cold is temporary, and that what matters is what is underneath. She wrote for 2 more hours. He read. At 10 o'clock they went upstairs. He stopped at her door, which was across the corridor from his, the separate rooms she had been given when she arrived, the careful distance that had been the first architecture of this marriage. He stood there for a moment. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I am glad," he said, "that it was you. Not, I am glad you came, or I am glad this worked out, or any of the forms of words that would have been technically true, but less precise." He said, "I am glad it was you, specifically, as if the universe had offered him options, and she was the one he would have chosen." She knew he meant exactly that. "So am I," she said. He nodded. Once. Then he said good night, and he went to his room, and she went to hers, and she lay in the dark for a while listening to the December wind, and feeling, with a completeness and a certainty she had not felt in a long time, entirely placed in the world. She had placed herself here, by choice, with her eyes open, and the place had turned out to be good, better than good. She closed her eyes. Outside, the winter dark pressed close to the windows of Ashmore Park and held the house gently, the way darkness holds things when it means them no harm. And inside, in 2 separate rooms across a narrow corridor, 2 people slept without trouble for the first time in longer than either of them had, and the house was very quiet, and the quiet was the right kind. In the first week of January, a visitor came to Ashmore Park who had not been expected. She arrived at midday, in a hired carriage rather than her own, which told Alara something before she even opened the door. The woman who came in was about 50, well-dressed in the manner of someone who had always been well-dressed and had stopped noticing it, with the face of someone who had been very beautiful once and was now interesting instead, which is the better outcome of the two. She introduced herself as Margaret, which was a name Alara recognized. She was a sister of Julian's father, an aunt he had mentioned once in passing in the context of something else and not revisited. Julian was out on the estate. Alara received the visitor herself, in the main sitting room, with tea, and the conversation that followed was one she had not expected, and which she thought about for many days afterward. Margaret sat with her tea and looked at the sitting room, which had been changed since Alara's arrival. The rearrangements, the flowers, the particular occupied quality of a room that is lived in rather than maintained, and she said, "It's different." "I've made some changes," Alara said. "Good changes," Margaret said. She looked at Alara directly, with the assessing quality of someone who had been thinking about this visit for some time. "I came because I wanted to see for myself." "See what?" Alara asked. "Whether what I've heard is true." She set down her cup. "I've heard that Julian that he has come back, in some measure. I did not believe it when I first heard it. I had visited him 3 years ago, before his mother died, and what I saw then," she stopped. "I loved Julian as a child. I have not been able to reach him since Edmund. I stopped trying, eventually, because every attempt seemed to make things worse rather than better." She looked at Alara steadily. "I want to know what you did." Alara held the woman's gaze. "I didn't do anything to him," she said. "I provided conditions. He did everything that actually mattered." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're younger than I expected. Most people say that." "And quieter." "That too." The older woman looked at her, with the expression of someone revising their assumptions in real time. "I want you to know," she said, "that when I heard about this marriage, I thought it was a mistake. I thought Hartwell had made a panicked decision, and that whoever he sent would be," she paused, "not adequate to what was needed." "Most people thought that," Alara said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Most people were wrong." She picked up her tea. "I would like to apologize on behalf of the people who were wrong. I cannot speak for all of them, but I can speak for myself." Alara looked at her. "I appreciate that," she said simply. They sat with the fire and the afternoon light, and the conversation moved to other things, to Julian as a boy, which Margaret remembered with fondness and some humor, and which gave Alara a texture of him she had not had before. She asked questions and stored the answers. She always asked questions. She always stored the answers. When Julian came in, stamping winter mud from his boots in the entrance hall, and found his aunt in the sitting room with his wife, his face went through several stages in rapid succession: surprise, wariness, and then, as he read Alara's expression, something that settled into ease. The afternoon that followed was, she thought afterward, one of the quieter joys of the year. Julian talked with his aunt in the way he talked with the tenants, not managing the conversation but being inside it, present, following where it led. Margaret asked him about the estate with genuine interest, and he answered with the specific, engaged knowledge that had developed over the past months. They talked about people they both knew. They disagreed about something political, both held their ground calmly, and moved on. At one point Margaret said, looking at the two of them, "You are very alike." Julian looked at Alara. "No," he said, "she is much better." "In some ways," Alara said. "In others you have ground on me." "Name them," he said. "You know the land," she said, "better than I ever will. I know plants, but you know land." He considered this. "That's one," he said. "You're better with numbers," she said. "The estate accounts." "That's two." "And you're calmer in a crisis," she said. "When something goes wrong in the physical estate, the drainage, the barn roof last September, you don't get anxious. You go and look and think and decide." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am not sure that's better. I think that might be the same quality that kept me from asking for help with other kinds of crises for 6 years." She considered this. "Fair," she said. "We'll call it mixed." Margaret looked between them. Her expression had the quality of someone watching something that is good and knowing it is good. She stayed for dinner in the evening, and when her hired carriage came to collect her at 9, she said goodnight to both of them at the door, and she said, to Alara specifically, "I will not leave it this long again." "I'm glad," Alara said. "Neither will I," Julian said, and he meant it. They stood at the door and watched the carriage lamps disappear down the drive, and the January night was very clear and very cold and full of stars, and they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. He said, "Thank you for receiving her." "She's family," Alara said. "Of course." He looked at her sideways, briefly, with the expression she knew by now, the one that appeared when he was moved, and was deciding whether to say so directly. He decided. "She came," he said, "because she heard I was well. And she found I am well, and the reason I am well is standing beside me." He looked forward again, at the dark where the carriage had been. "I thought you should know that I know that. Not as an obligation, as a fact." She took his hand, not with any commentary, just took it. They stood at the door of Ashmore Park, in the cold January night, and the stars were very bright and very far away, and the house was warm behind them, and the garden was bare and perfectly ready for what was coming, and the roots were deep and the roots were strong, and everything was exactly as it needed to be. Spring returned to Ashmore Park the way spring always returns to places that have been through difficult winters. Not gently, not with any particular announcement, but with the sudden and total commitment of something that has been building underground for months, and has finally decided the time is right. The lavender came up first, because lavender always came up first, pushing its gray-green spikes above the soil, with the particular efficiency of a plant that knows exactly what it is doing and requires no encouragement. Then the roses showed their first red shoots along the arch, tight and decisive, and Alara saw them on a March morning, and felt a satisfaction that was not about triumph. She had never wanted it to be about triumph, but about completion of a simple promise she had made to herself in the February cold, when she first stood in this garden and looked at what it could be. She had said, "This is what it will look like." And here it was, looking like that. George Voss arrived on a Wednesday in late April, which was precisely the moment she had timed his visit for. Late enough that the garden was genuinely awake, early enough that the lavender's best days were still ahead. He arrived looking better than he had in 2 years, the specific better of a man whose health had stabilized and who had taken that stabilization as permission to become interested in things again. He came with a travel bag and 3 of his journals, and a look of someone arriving somewhere they had been curious about for a long time. Julian met him in the entrance hall, which Alara had not quite expected. She had thought Julian might do the careful thing, give them the entrance alone and appear at the appropriate social moment. He did not. He came to the hall when the carriage pulled up and opened the door himself, which was Kabe's job, and Kabe stepped aside for it, without any expression of surprise, which told her it was not the first time Julian had done something like this. Her father stepped in, and Julian shook his hand and said something that she did not hear because she was still coming down the stairs. She heard her father laugh. Her father's laugh, which she had been afraid she might not hear freely again, came out in the entrance hall of Ashmore Park, with the full sound of itself, and she stopped on the stairs for a moment. Then she came down, and her father turned to her, and the look on his face when he saw her was the kind of look that a father has when he has been worried about his daughter for a long time, and is now, seeing her, no longer worried. "You look well," he said. "I feel well," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the assessment of someone who knows her very well. "More than well," he said, with a precision that told her he was not just being polite. "You look like yourself, but more." She thought about what that meant, more of the same, or more of something new. "Both," he said. She brought him inside and showed him the house, not all of it, not all at once, because the house was large and she had learned not to overwhelm people with it. She showed him the library, which he stood in for a long time, with the expression of a man in a place he would like to live. She showed him the room she had arranged for him, on the south side where the light was best in the morning. She showed him, last and with the specific care of something saved for the end, the garden. He walked through it slowly, the way he always walked through things he was interested in. Not quickly, not showing off how fast he could process it, but with the thoroughness of someone who wants to actually know what they are looking at. He stopped at the lavender border for a long time. He looked at the rose arch. He identified the apple trees and commented on the pruning, with the approval of someone who knows pruning and recognizes when it has been done well. At the end of the south path, he stopped and turned to her. "You built this," he said. "Graves and I," she said, "and more recently Julian." Her father looked at the arch. "Your mother had a rose arch," he said. "Did I ever tell you that? Before you were born, in the house before Aldgate Street. She was very particular about it." He paused. "She would have liked this," Elara looked at the arch. I think she would have, she said. She would have had opinions about the variety, he said, with the specific affection of a man remembering his wife's opinions. She always had opinions about varieties, Elara agreed. He laughed. She laughed. The garden was full of morning light, and the lavender was beginning, at the tips of its gray spikes, to show the first trace of purple that preceded flowering. Julian appeared at the edge of the garden with 2 cups of coffee, which he handed over without any particular announcement, and then he stood at the edge of the south bed and let her father talk to him about plants for the better part of an hour. Her father, she could see, had recognized within approximately 3 minutes that Julian knew the land, and knew this land specifically, and had gone directly to the specific questions that could only be answered by someone with that knowledge. Her father listened to the answers with the respect of one informed person listening to another. She stood a little apart and watched them, and what she felt was difficult to name, but was something in the family of joy, perhaps the more solid cousin of it, the feeling of something that was genuinely right, being genuinely visible. After lunch, her father and Julian spent 2 hours in the library discussing the second of her father's books, which Julian had read in full. She could hear them from the corridor, 2 voices in a genuine back and forth, the tone of 2 people who are arguing pleasurably about something they both care about. She stood in the corridor for a moment and simply listened, and the sound of it was so entirely different from the sound this house had made when she first came to it, that she felt the difference physically, as something in the chest. Then she went to the garden, because there was work to do in the south bed, and she was not the kind of person who listened at doors. Graves was already there, working along the west corner with the quiet competence that defined him. She picked up her gloves and joined him, and they worked alongside each other for an hour in the warm spring afternoon, without much talk, because Graves was not a talking worker, and she had learned to match his rhythm. At one point he said, "Lavender's going to be good this year." "I think so," she said. "Better than last year." "The first year is always hard," she said. "Establishing takes everything." He nodded. "Second year, they put the energy in the right places." "Yes," she said, "they do." She thought about what he had said, later, when the day had gone to evening, and the lavender was in shadow, and the house had settled into its evening warmth. Second year, they put the energy in the right places. She thought that was as good a description as any of what had happened over the past year at Ashmore Park, and over the past year in the person of Julian Cavendish, and in her own life, which had been changed by this year in ways she was still discovering. She had established, she had put down roots, the long, difficult roots that do not show but hold everything up, and now, in the second year, she was beginning to flower in the specific sense of putting the energy in the right places. The right places, she was learning, were both more and different from what she had expected when she stepped into this marriage. She had expected to be useful. She had not expected to be happy. She had not expected to find someone who looked at her with the attention and respect that Julian now gave to everything she said and did and thought. She had not expected to find herself, on an ordinary Wednesday in May, standing in a garden she had grown from bare earth, and thinking, "This is where I am supposed to be." Not supposed to in the sense of obligation, in the sense of fit, the sense of a thing in the right conditions. She had placed herself here. She was glad. The evening of her father's second day at Ashmore Park, the 4 of them sat at the dining table. Herself, Julian, her father, and Mrs. Partridge, who had been invited to join, and had accepted with the dignity of someone who understood what the invitation meant. The conversation went everywhere and nowhere, which is what good dinner conversation does. Her father told a story about a collecting expedition that had ended badly and somewhat comically, which had not been funny at the time. Julian told one about a parliamentary debate that had gone entirely off the rails. Mrs. Partridge said something dry and precisely observed about the estate's previous cook that made everyone laugh. Elara sat and listened and participated, and thought, this is what the house sounds like when it is a home. Not the managed silence, not the careful, practiced quiet of a place holding its breath. This, voices and laughter and the sound of people who are comfortable with each other, which is the best sound a house can make. After dinner, while her father and Mrs. Partridge were still at the table over their tea, Julian and Elara stood in the doorway that led from the dining room to the garden. The night was mild enough for it, one of those April nights that is warmer than April has any right to be, with the smell of the soil coming up through the dark. He stood beside her and looked at the garden, which was only visible in outline in the dark, the arch, the border, the shapes of things. Your father approves, he said. He does, she said, of the garden and of everything else. Julian looked at the arch. Do you know what I was thinking about today? In the library, while he and I were talking. Tell me, she said. I was thinking that I spent 6 years in a room I couldn't leave, he said. Not a physical room. The other kind. The kind made of guilt and grief, and the belief that I didn't deserve to come out of it. He paused. I was thinking that I came out of it, and that the person who made it possible to come out of it is standing next to me. She looked at the dark garden. You came out of it yourself, she said. I've told you that. I know you think that, he said. I know you believe it, but I also know that what you did was real, and that the correct response to real things is acknowledgement. He turned to look at her. In the faint light from the house, his face was clear, and the expression on it was fully formed, and had been for a long time, not developing, not approaching, but arrived, settled, entirely present. You are the most extraordinary person I have known, not because you fixed something broken, because you looked at it honestly and stayed, because you gave it what it needed without waiting to be thanked for it, because you treated a very difficult situation as something worth your full attention and then gave it that attention, for months, without any guarantee that it would work. She held his gaze. There was nothing she needed to deflect here. She did not feel the need to minimize what he was saying. She received it, as it was offered, genuinely, clearly, from the part of him that was now, finally, fully present. I thought it was worth trying, she said. It was, he said. I hope you know that from the inside now, not just as a result, as a thing you can be certain of. I am certain of it, she said. He took her hand, she took his. They stood in the doorway between the lit house and the dark garden, and behind them, the sound of her father's voice and Mrs. Partridge's steady response was warm and easy, and ahead of them, the garden waited with all its deep roots and its coming spring, and the lavender was barely visible in the dark, but entirely there, entirely established, entirely ready for what the season was about to bring. Society would have other opinions in the months that followed. Society would find the Ashmore story, a duke recovered, an estate revived, a marriage that had been predicted to fail, a satisfying narrative about the power of good breeding and natural resilience. It would not ask the right questions. It would not give credit in the right places. This was not new, and it was not surprising. But in the garden of Ashmore Park, on a warm April night, none of that mattered. What mattered was the lavender. What mattered was the rose arch, budded and ready. What mattered was her father's laugh coming from inside the house, and Julian's hand in hers, and the particular quality of the silence between them, which was not the old silence, the held-breath silence, the managed silence, the silence of a house that did not know how to speak, but the new one. The silence of a place that is at peace. The silence of people who are content. The silence of roots that have taken hold, deep and strong, and are no longer concerned with the cold. She looked at the garden. She thought of what it had been when she arrived, bare and gray, and carefully not dead. She thought of the first stakes and the first cuttings, and the February walks in the cold, and the morning she came downstairs and found Julian had been up since 6. She thought of the east wing floor and the north window, and the letter from Gerald Holt's solicitors, which she had never forgotten, and which had been the hinge on which things had turned. She had not known, on any of those individual mornings, whether the morning would be enough. She had never known whether what she was doing would work. She had simply worked, each day, with what was actually there. This was what was actually there now. It was more than enough. She looked at the lavender. She looked at the arch. She looked at the house, warm and lit, with the sound of people inside it who were glad to be there. She looked at Julian, who was looking at her. Next summer, she said, because it was the phrase she had made a habit of, looking ahead, with practical confidence, to what was coming. Next summer, he said, and then, and the one after, and the one after that. She smiled. The involuntary kind. The real kind. Yes, she said. The garden was quiet. The house was warm. The roots were deep. And that was everything. The morning after her father's visit, Alara woke before the sun was properly up and lay listening to the house in the way she had learned to listen to it. Not for problems, just for its quality. She had learned to read the house the way her father had taught her to read a field, by paying attention to what it was doing, not what you expected it to be doing. What the house was doing this morning was breathing. That was the only word she had found for it. The slow, quiet, rhythmic life of a house where the people inside it were at rest and not in pain. She had not heard it in the early months. She heard it now. She got up, she dressed, she went down. Julian was in the kitchen, not something she had seen before, but she had learned not to treat new things as remarkable, because remarking on them had a way of making them self-conscious, and therefore less likely to repeat. He was standing at the range with a very serious expression, engaged in what appeared to be a negotiation with a pot of something. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making porridge," he said, "for your father. He mentioned at dinner that he liked porridge in the morning, and cook is not here yet." She looked at the pot. "Have you made porridge before?" "Once," he said, "about 20 years ago. It did not go well." "Do you want help?" "Yes," he said, "please." She came and stood beside him, and looked at the pot, and told him what needed adjusting, and they made the porridge together in the early morning kitchen, which smelled of coal and warmth and the faint green smell of the herbs Mrs. Partridge grew on the windowsill, and Julian stirred with the careful application he brought to all practical tasks, and Alara stood close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and outside the kitchen window, the spring dawn was doing its slow work on the sky. Her father came down half an hour later to find breakfast on the table, properly made, and both of them already eating and talking about the Southfield's drainage requirements, which her father immediately joined in on because he had opinions about drainage too, and saw no reason not to share them. The conversation carried on through breakfast and into a walk in the garden, which was one of those rare mornings where the air is so clear and the light so direct that everything looks as if someone has made it newly. Her father walked the lavender border with his hands behind his back and said things about the planting density and the soil amendment that Alara found genuinely useful and wrote down in her notebook. Julian walked with them. He did not say a great deal on this walk. He was a listener in the presence of two people who were engaged in the specific, joyful exchange of people who love the same subject and are discovering each other's knowledge of it. But he listened with full attention, and once or twice he asked a question that opened a direction neither she nor her father had thought to go, and the questions were good ones, and her father responded to each with the evident pleasure of a man being taken seriously. At the end of the walk, near the rose arch, her father stopped and looked at the two of them together, and he said, in the plain and direct way of a man who has decided to say the true thing, "I made a decision without asking you," he said to Alara. "I have been sorry for that every day." "I know," she said. "I would have asked," he said. "If I had not been afraid, you'd have reasons not to come." "I might have," she said honestly. "I'm glad you didn't ask." Her father looked at Julian. "She would have found her way here eventually," he said. "By some other route. She always finds her way to where she ought to be." "Yes," Julian said, looking at her. "I've come to believe that." Her father nodded, with the simplicity of a man who has said the thing that needed saying, and does not need to add anything to it. Then he pointed at the rose arch and said, "That will flower beautifully this summer. You'll want to support the long canes before the blooms come, or the weight will pull them down." She took out her notebook and wrote it down. The three of them stood in the spring garden and looked at the arch, and the conversation moved to other things, to what she would plant along the east wall next year, to a particular variety of apple her father was interested in trialing, to nothing of consequence and everything that mattered. The morning opened around them, warm and clear and unhurried, in the way that mornings have when a house has come back to itself, and the people in it are not afraid of the day. Later, when her father had gone to rest before the afternoon, and Julian had gone to his study to attend to correspondence, Ilara walked the south path alone. She walked it the way she had walked it on her first morning at Ashmore Park, deliberately, noticing, paying attention. But the things she noticed now were different. She noticed the lavender not as potential, as she had noticed it then, but as reality. She noticed the apple trees not as neglected structures needing intervention, but as responding ones, the new growth visible, the pruned shape beginning to emerge from the action she and Graves had taken last autumn. She noticed the rose arch not as the skeleton of something past, but as the frame of something coming. Everything she had looked at in February, and seen as what could be, was now visibly, becoming what it would be. And the process was not finished. It would never be finished, because gardens don't finish, and neither do people. But it was underway, in the irreversible way of things that have taken root. She stopped at the south end of the path and stood still. She thought about the day she had stood here with her notebook on the February morning, making her first observations of the estate. She thought about the note she had written. Begin with what is real. She had begun with what was real. What was real, on that February morning, had been a broken garden, a closed house, a suffering man, and herself, with her notebook, her sensible boots, the knowledge her father had given her, and the knowledge her mother's illness had given her, and the specific quality of stubbornness that she had always had and had learned, over time, to call by its better name, which was perseverance. What was real now was this garden in its spring, and the house with her father's voice in it, and a marriage that had become a partnership that had become. She had not had the word for it until recently, but she had the word for it now. Home. It had become home. Not the home she had expected. She had not expected anything, which was probably why the actuality of it had been able to exceed all she could have imagined. She had come in without pictures in her head of how it should look, and what had grown in that open space was this: specific, complicated, real, and better than pictures. She heard footsteps on the path behind her, and she did not turn, because she knew the sound of them. Julian came and stood beside her. He did not ask what she was doing. He understood, by now, that there were times when she was simply standing somewhere and thinking, and that standing somewhere and thinking was its own complete activity that did not require explanation or company. He simply stood with her. After a moment she said, "Thank you for the porridge." "It was adequate," he said. "It was excellent," she said. "It was adequate," he said, with the specific stubbornness of a man who has a different threshold for excellence and will not be moved from it. She smiled at that, at the stubbornness, at the precision, at the fact that she knew his threshold for excellence, and he knew hers, and they had each adapted to the others, without either of them having to ask the other to change. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the east wall." "What about it?" "What to plant next year. My father suggested a certain variety of climbing plant. I wrote it down. I want to look at the aspect again before I decide." He looked at the east wall. "The morning light is good there," he said, "and it's sheltered from the north." "That's what I thought," she said. They stood and looked at the east wall together, and the spring day was quiet around them, and the lavender border moved slightly in a breath of wind, and somewhere up on the roof, a bird was making its small, serious business of the morning. She put her notebook in her pocket. She looked at the garden. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. They walked back to the house together, through the lavender and the rose arch and the apple trees in their new prune shapes, and the door of Ashmore Park opened as they reached it. Cobby, ever attentive, and the warmth of the house came out to meet them. Behind them, the garden went on with its quiet, essential work. In front of them, the house waited with everything in it. They went inside. The door closed, and the year, which had given them so much already, turned toward its best part.